I've compiled all the woodworking tips and tricks that I've shared on this channel, as well as the mistakes to avoid while you're woodworking, all in one compilation video. Let's go. I'm going to show you a jig that can joint boards. It can also do tapering, a high fence, clamping capabilities, and much more. And it's easy to build. Let's go. All you need to build this awesome jig is a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood, 2 of these micro jig clamps, and a dovetail bit. Theirs, it works well, but any 14-degree dovetail bit will work. I'm going to make this one 4 foot long. You can make it as long or as short as you want, but about 3 to 4 feet is best, depending on the length of boards you typically joint or taper. First thing we're going to do is set our table saw up to rip a piece of scrap plywood 10 inches. You just need a 10-inch wide piece. That's all you need, about 3 foot long. The main thing here is that you get a piece of straight plywood. In other words, it's not bent, bowed, or anything like that. I'm using 3/4 inch sanded birch. You can use whatever kind you got as long as it's about 3/4 of an inch thick. Now we've got our plywood cut to size. I've made mine 10 inches by 4 feet long. Now the next thing we're going to do is install a dovetail bit. This bit comes from Micro Jig, and it works with their dovetail clamps, and I use that on a ton of things in the shop. I'm gonna set this up at 3/8 inch deep cut, because that's how deep you need to cut these. Then I'm gonna set the edge guide 2 inches from the center of the bit. If you don't have an edge guide, you can simply use a scrap piece of plywood to set up an edge guide so that this bit will run 2 inches from the edge of the board. You can double stick tape this, you can clamp it, however you need to do it. All right, we cut those 2 long grooves. Now all we have to do is divide this up to cut our cross grooves. You're gonna measure off the end 4 inches on both ends. These don't have to be precise. You're not building a clock, you're building a jointing jig. So if it's close, it's fine. You're also gonna wanna make a mark right in the center, and for us, it's gonna be 2 feet or 24 inches. And then you'll also want to divide that in half again and make a mark at 1 foot and 3 feet. That's going to be our grooves. We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grooves going across. This is a frame and square fence. You can put it on any frame and square, and it basically takes it, makes it a giant speed square, so you can do stuff just like this and just use it as a straight edge or right angle guide. That's what I'm going to do. Next thing I'm gonna do is just mark 1 inch from each corner, and then we're gonna cut these at a 45-degree angle. Basically just give this a little dog ear on each corner just to knock those sharp edges off. You don't have to do this. If you just wanna sand that around, you can, or just leave it like it is. And again, you're not building a clock, just get it close, it'll look fine. From there, I just take some sandpaper. You can use 120 grit or whatever you want. Just knock the rough edges or any of those little splinters you may see in there because it's plywood. Just kind of smooth that up. It doesn't take much at all. The thing you're gonna do is take out that dovetail bit and put in a chamfer and or roundover bit if you want to kind of soften these edges up. If not, you can just take sandpaper and hit the edge of that right there just to knock that sharp edge off. But only do 3 sides. You're gonna do the 2 short sides and 1 long side. 1 long side you're gonna leave at a sharp 90-degree angle for a purpose. Now take your sander, 120 grit's fine here. You're gonna sand the whole thing, front, back, upside down, everything. Then the next thing you wanna do is throw on some type of wax, or my preference, Outlaws board butter. Throw that on the bottom of it, especially on the bottom. That's gonna help it slide on your table saw much easier. You can also put it on the top just to give it a little extra protection. We have our jig. Now we can joint boards, we can taper boards if you're making tapered legs, things like that, and we can use it as a high fence. The way this works is you're just gonna lay the board that you're gonna want to joint. We're gonna do jointing first. Lay that right up there. First slide on your micro jig dovetail clamps. Lay the board that you are jointing on top, and then just clamp it down. Super simple. Now I can joint this board. I can joint boards probably, I would guess, up to 6 feet, because on the smaller, the 3 foot one, I could joint them up to about 5 feet easily. About a foot off of each end, and you should be able to push it through your saw safely and easily. Once everything's clamped down, you're gonna put the square edge against your blade. The chamfered edge will go against the fence. This is a perfect tapering jig because all you have to do is line up the mark, in other words, the width on each end. If the top of my taper was 2 inches wide and the bottom was 1 inch wide, all I do is line up both of those marks on the edge here and then just run it through. And you can repeat this over and over and over. You can even make stops to go in these little grooves using the other hardware they have, make it easier to make repeatable cuts. Another thing that's extremely useful about this is now you can have a high fence that'll clamp onto any existing fence. What that's awesome for is if you have to make grooves in the ends of plywood or other panels or raised panels, if you wanted to angle that blade, and you could use this as extra support vertically. This is perfect for that. It's super strong, it doesn't bend or flex, and it clamps to any fence you got. As you can see, this jig will work perfectly fine on a job site saw, a cabinet saw, anything you got. One thing you could do if you wanted to make this super accurate, in other words, not really rely on the fence at all, is put a miter bar or a piece of wood that goes on the inside the miter slot. You could do that if you didn't want to fool the fence. I found that I like using the fence just as a guide because it makes it fast, simple, and you don't have to worry about trying to get that miter slot lined up or anything like that. On thinner pieces, you'll want to make sure that your clamp is not going to contact that blade because it can get over that far if you're not careful. Just keep an eye on that, you'll be fine. If you joint shorter boards or you have a job site saw, this 4-foot version will work on the job site saw. It's really not that unwieldy back here. Just this is easier to handle if you got a smaller saw just because of the bed is smaller. Saw how that tips like that. The shorter one's not going to do that as much. So if you have a smaller saw and you don't normally joint long boards, I would really recommend the 3-footer. And if you're making the 3-footer, it's the exact same way to make the 4-footer. You're going to measure off 4 inches off each end. Then you'll measure right in the center and then split the center from the 4-inch. So basically you're just going to divide it in half and then divide it in half again. One other awesome thing you can do with this jig we just built is now we have a way to clamp things to our table. If you got a couple of quick clamps, clamp this to the table. Now we have a way to clamp things up here like this. If we needed to work on this piece of plywood or route into a groove like we did this, and you don't have T-tracks, this is an excellent way to do it. This micro jig match fit system is so versatile. I bought this myself and I've enjoyed having it in the shop. I've used it on a ton of projects. I've used it in my previous workbench where I now got the CNC, but before I was able to clamp things down before I had T-tracks. And I used it on my crosscut sled and the mobile workbench that I built previously that has a bunch of different clamping options. So one of the most common questions I get is how to prevent a pocket screw from popping through on the other side when you're joining two pieces like this. Nobody likes to see that. I'm going to show you how to make sure that never happens again to you. Also, I'm going to show you how to fix that once it does happen, plus many more pocket hole tips and tricks. Stay tuned. There is a very simple way to prevent that from ever happening again to you so that the pocket hole screw does not break through the other side of the board that you're joining. Let me show you how. So this is 1x material. This is a 1x6, and we're using the Masket pocket hole jig to join the two boards together. These are actually 3/4 of an inch thick. And so we've got our setting at 3/4 of an inch. You use the included depth guide to set your pocket hole bit stop collar depth. The easiest and simplest way to make sure that that doesn't happen to you again when you're drilling pocket holes, it's extremely simple. You've got your depth stop at 3/4 of an inch. You set your bit at 3/4 of an inch and it's still breaking through. Let me show you how to fix it. Simply back off the stop collar, raise it up about 1/8 inch. If you're not sure what 1/8 inch is, you can just rotate this depth guide around till it says 7/8 of an inch. Set your depth on your depth collar at 7/8 instead of 3/4. When you rotate this around to 3/4, it's going to be 1/8 of an inch higher or less deep or more shallow than you're actually needing to drill. This will prevent those screws from breaking through. This goes for all pocket hole jigs, no matter what brand you're using. I found this to be pretty common, especially when you're joining softwoods like spruce, pine, things like that, because they compress more because they're softer. Now, if I'm joining those two together with the settings that I created versus the recommended settings, no breakthrough. If it's still breaking through the wood and you set your stop collar just like I showed you, I'll tell you why that is in just a minute. If you like that first tip, stick around. I've got a lot more coming. I'm Matt with 731woodworks.com. They call me the Pocket Hole King. I've also got pocketholeking.com if you want to go check that out. I want to teach you some things about pocket hole joinery that may help you along your way in your woodworking journey. I'm here to help you. Let's get started. So when you drive your pocket hole screws, you want to make sure to adjust down the pressure or the torque that your drill, if it has that setting, you can turn that down so that it's not driving it as hard. Same thing as your impact driver, you flip that down to a 1 so that it doesn't actually force the screw through the other side of the material. So you're making a project and one of your screws pops through because you didn't have the depth set correctly, or you overdrove the screw and now it's popped through your project and you're devastated, right? Because now you got a giant hole with this screw popping through, plus it split the wood a little bit. So how do we fix it? Well, the first thing you got to do is you're going to need to back that screw out. You want to back it till it's beneath the surface of the wood, okay? And typically on a softwood, it has already torn through some of this stuff, and you want to get all that loose wood off of there because it's going to come off when you sand it anyway. If you're painting this, it really doesn't matter. You can use some wood filler, sand it, paint over it. Nobody's ever going to know except for you and the good Lord, right? But if you're staining it, then you're going to want that to blend with knot holes and things like that. That's where this stuff comes in. I've got a whole video dedicated to CA glue. Basically, this is a colored super glue. It dries extremely fast when you use the accelerator with it, okay? This stuff is so simple to use. It dries hard as a rock. So here, you're just gonna take, this is brown. I like to use brown on if I'm staining with dark walnut, special walnut, that type colors. If you're staining with a black color, then you would use the black colored CA glue, but you put a little dab on there, let it kind of soak in for just a minute, and then you'll take your activator, spray that activator on there. It's gonna dry within 30 seconds, usually within about 15 or 20 seconds. It'll dry that CA glue up. Then you can sand that smooth and it's gonna look like a knot hole. And that's how you fix when those screws pop through like that. When you're putting together, especially like if you're doing panels, so we'll pretend this is a panel glue up where you're making a tabletop or something. When you use pocket holes, if these two edges aren't perfectly square, when the pocket holes tighten up, it's going to cause these two pieces of wood to cant a little bit like that. And when that happens, your tabletop's gonna be all wompy jawed because you'll have, say, 4 or 5 screws per board, and every time you tighten one down, it just gets like that. So make sure these two edges are actually perfectly square, either with a jointer or jointing with a table saw like I've done before. I'll link a video in the description below on how to joint with a table saw. I used to put wood together like that. When you don't use the proper clamps, what happens is your two pieces of wood are actually uneven now. You see that lip? So now I have to do something about that. I either have to come in and sand that, or I have to plane that down somehow. So the best way to prevent that from happening is a face clamp. This is a basket brand face clamp. You can get any kind you want. I'll put links in the description below to these tools. I didn't have one of these for a very long time. I really didn't think they were necessary, but I was absolutely wrong about that. So the way these work is there's 2 flat pieces of metal on each side, and they actually will tilt to fit however the wood is oriented on a flat surface. And then there's a tightening screw down here that actually adjusts the tension when the clamps come together. And then there's a quick release right there that lets you release it. When you put this face clamp on like that, I've got it close to that screw. This is perfectly flush now because these 2 pieces of wood are exactly the same thickness. So this is going to keep that nice and flush, and it's not going to let it get off balance or out of alignment because you've got this clamp on there. What I like to do is, if you can get a face clamp on it, if it's in a place where you can, is to put it right where the screw is going to go in. Even if you've got 2 side by side, I'll clamp that side and then I'll just move the clamp over. Now you can see that joint is almost perfectly flush. I mean, it's not exactly perfect, but it is much closer. Right down here is perfectly flush. There is a very, very tiny lip that you could hit with 120 grit sandpaper, a couple of passes, and that would be flush. The bottom side is flush as well. So those face clamps are worth every penny, and they're only about, I don't know, $15 or $20. So I highly recommend getting a couple of them. Hey, if you're getting value out of this video, click that subscribe button, click the bell icon next to it so you get notified of all our new content. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're building your project, it's going to be outdoors, make sure you use outdoor rated screws versus interior screws. And the way you tell those apart is a lot of times these interior screws are just going to be silver. They're like zinc coated or something like that. And these outdoor screws actually have like almost a plastic looking coating on there, and they're blue. I don't know exactly what they're coated with, but they feel like a plastic coating, and that keeps them things from rusting. When you got a project like our recent outdoor sectional build, you want to make sure you're using outdoor screws on that, because the last thing you want to happen is you've made this awesome project and in a year or two down the road, those screws start rusting and breaking on you. You don't want that to happen. Use those outdoor screws for outdoor projects. They're about the same price as an interior screw. You just need to decide which one you're gonna need. When you get ready to put some pocket holes in some of this beautiful Purple Heart, ooh, if you're drilling into hardwoods like oak, Purple Heart, cherry, maple, anything like that, you're using hardwoods, you wanna make sure that you're picking the right screw. So here you see we have a piece of Purple Heart, which is a very hard wood. We got a piece of spruce, which is very soft like pine. On the soft woods like pine and spruce, you're gonna be using those coarse thread screws, and on hardwood, you'll be using these more fine thread. You can really see the difference with them sitting side by side, the difference in the fine versus the coarse threads. The fine threads are made with that self-tapping tip so that it will help actually not split your hardwoods. So you make sure you use those fine threads for hardwood. Another good thing to remember is if you're using plywood, say 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch plywood to build a project, whether that be cabinets or whatever you're making out of the plywood, and you need to pocket hole join those things together, make sure you measure your plywood, because 3/4 inch plywood is rarely ever 3/4 of an inch actual. So if you're going to be setting your pocket hole jig at 3/4 of an inch, you set your bit depth at 3/4 of an inch, it's going to drill too deep. The actual thickness of the plywood, and even in this case here where I've got this piece, it's about a full 1/16 inch shy of 3/4 of an inch. But you want to make sure you set the depth correct on your pocket hole jig and your bit. One thing that I actually waited a very long time to buy is this, I think it's called a 90-degree clamp, but I typically just call it a thingamajig clamp. This one's made from Craig. It's a really good clamp. It is that same flat metal piece that will adjust a little bit to however it's oriented on the board. And it's got a 3/8 inch metal dowel actually made into it. And you're just gonna clamp that into that pocket hole. So if you've got 2 pocket holes or a long panel, you can actually take this and help hold it in place. This thing is fantastic. I should have got one of these a very, very long time ago. Now these are a little more expensive than your face clamp. This one I think is like $30 or so. I'll put a link in the description below to the thingamajig clamp. But these work awesome if you're trying to join 2 pieces at a 90-degree angle, which you do a lot in pocket hole joinery. Then once you have that screw in there, that screw is going to act like a clamp, and you can just move this one off and put a screw in that hole and you're done. Another neat little trick you can do with a pocket hole bit is you can loosen this stop collar off, slide it down onto your bit. So I'm going to set this to about halfway of the thickness of the lumber. So you'll just set that stop collar to where the shoulder of this bit, not the long point, but this shoulder right here is about halfway of the thickness of your stock or your piece of wood. And then you'll just tighten down that stop collar and make sure that it's actually on the flat part of your drill bit and it doesn't go down into the groove just because it won't tighten up right. So now you can use this to countersink a screw. So I'm joining these two without pocket. If I'm not using a pocket hole for whatever reason, I want to join these together. All you gotta do now is you've already got that 3/8 inch hole for the countersink. You can just take a wood dowel, like this is a 3/8 inch dowel, put a little wood glue on it. You'll hear it when it bottoms out. Just take a flush trim saw at that point. Trim that dowel off, you can sand it flat and it'll give you a good little... Now you can see that dowel is right there, you sanded it flush, and that gives you a different option for joinery if you don't want those pocket hole screws showing, but you still want to screw everything together. You can just use those dowel rods and fill that hole. You got a perfectly drilled 3/8 inch countersunk hole. You can use those 3/8 inch dowels to fill that and then sand them flush. If you're interested in the tools, the jigs, supplies that we're using in this video, there's a link in the description below to take you to those products. So I also get a lot of questions asking if they can just use a regular screw instead of a pocket hole screw. I don't recommend that because a pocket hole screw actually has a flat head, almost like a washer on the end right there. Whereas a typical screw, you see it has that angled head on there. That's going to let it drive too deep for you, and you're not going to like the outcome because it's going to be popping through like before, and you're going to have to fix that hole. So I would highly recommend just picking up some pocket screws. Make sure you're getting good quality ones. I'll drop links in the description below to some that I recommend so that you don't get cheap ones that break on you too easy. So this is a cross section. I just cut this board just so that you can see what a pocket hole looks like from the side. And you see where this bit has gone in there and it stops right there. What does that do? You can actually see the imprint of the long bit right there. It's pretty cool. So that stops right there and creates that shoulder, but it also has pre-drilled the hole for you. So when you drive your regular pocket screw in there, It drives down until it hits the shoulder and it stops, and you can see that the pocket screw is sticking through there. So that's how they work, and that's how they're supposed to work. What happens when you use a regular screw that has that angled head and doesn't have the washer head, just like a pocket screw has, that flat head, when you use this type screw and it drives down in there, what ends up happening is that there's nowhere to stop because of that angled head, so it just continues to go. And you can even see here, it continues to push on through until it actually drive on past where that shoulder's at, and it'll actually go too deep or it'll bust the wood because it wasn't made for this type screw. You know what time it is, power tip time. So my power tip for pocket hole joinery is to always, always, always have an extra pocket hole drill bit on hand. If you've been using pocket hole joinery very long at all, you know that the tips of these pocket hole bits are very, very brittle and fragile. You'll drop it, it'll hit the pavement, and the next thing you know, well, bam. You've broken the tip off and it no longer works as a pocket hole bit. So it actually don't work for anything. You just throw it away. They're not expensive at all, so make sure to pick up a couple. I usually keep at least 2 or 3 on hand because I'm very clumsy. I'll drop the pocket hole bit and it'll hit the concrete and then break the tip right off. When you do throw them away, keep the stop collar because they're still good and you may need it one down the road. Here's a bonus tip for you. This is a rare earth magnet. They are very, very, very sticky. They will stick to metal. This is aluminum, it won't stick to that. It won't stick to that, it won't stick to that, all that's aluminum. But this piece, the actual clamp, is metal. It'll stick to that. Why do you need a magnet there? Your bits will stick to it. And so will your Allen wrenches so that you can adjust your pocket hole jig. This is extremely handy because it keeps everything right here, especially if you don't have a box to keep it in. It doesn't get in the way of the clamp. It doesn't get in the way of the material that you're using to drill pocket holes with. Now I just threw those on there and you can see it's a pretty strong magnet. You can actually stick them through from the bottom or on the other side and it keeps it a little more out of the way. That's just a good quick fix for you. You can see it's not in the way of the pocket hole clamp at all. You can just move those back and forth and it'll hold everything in place so that you don't lose any of your bits, drivers, or adjustment wrenches. So I get a lot of questions asking what size pocket hole screw you need for the size material that you're going to be using to join together. Go to pocketholeking.com. Right there on the front page, I've got a screw guide that tells you exactly what size screw you're going to need for the material size you're using. These are 5 wood storage mistakes that you should avoid at all costs. Well, at most costs. Let's go. Number 1 on the list is acclimation. What does that mean? That means when you bring the wood into the shop, it needs to sit in the environment it's going to be cut and milled in for a while. Now, what's recommended is a week or 2, but I know for a fact that a lot of times you don't have that much time. 48 hours really is minimum, but there are cases where you're going to bring it in, you're going to cut it, you're going to put your wood project together without it acclimating. Now, we're talking best practices. Now, why would you want to do that? Number 1 is it needs to adjust to the humidity as well as the temperature in your shop. I have a climate controlled shop now, but for years I didn't. And so it just had to adjust to whatever the shop was at the time, whether that be hot or cold, etc. So it just depends on if you're having your wood shipped to you from out of state, out of area, or if you're picking it up at your local lumber yard or home store. That's gonna play a part in the process. For instance, if I go to my local store, pick out some lumber and bring it home and use it right away, theoretically it's going to be okay because I'm only a few miles away from that area. We're the same temperature, same humidity, etc. But I do get hardwood shipped in because we can't buy them locally, and those I do absolutely let them sit for a week, 2, sometimes months before I actually get to using them, but 48 hours is a good minimum rule of thumb. Now, the reason you want it to acclimate to your environment is because of the humidity change, the temperature change. If you use it right away, there is a chance that that wood is going to bow and bend and split, all that good stuff, bad stuff, when you use it inside a project, and that's where things go bad, and that's what you're trying to avoid. So letting it acclimate is going to help. One of the best things I ever bought for this shop, and I still use it even with climate control, is my dehumidifier. It is a little bit pricey. You can get smaller models, but I chose this one specifically because it will keep the humidity in this shop between 30 and 50%, and I can just leave it on 24/7. I can connect a hose to it, run that outside, and it's always running when the humidity gets above whatever you set it at. That has helped the wood movement and the usability of the lumber that I keep in the shop tremendously. I would highly recommend considering one of those, especially if you're in a humid environment. I'll link to one in the description that I have, but feel free to research and find one that works for your shop. Number 2 on the list is storing lumber directly on the ground or on the concrete if you have a concrete floor. This is a huge no-no. You should avoid this at all costs. Now, it makes sense why you wouldn't store it on the ground, I think, but on concrete you think you're safe, but you're not. The reason is concrete is porous, so it absorbs the moisture in the air, and moisture is heavier than air, so all the time it's going to fall and settle on your concrete whether you see it or not. Then when you put your lumber on the ground or on the concrete, your lumber starts soaking up that just like a sponge would. Now, lumber is also porous. If you think of straws being stacked together, that's basically the enlarged version of wood, because as the grain runs long ways on your lumber, that's basically straws are running, microscopic straws running all the way up that board. So it's soaking up that wood, that moisture. What that's going to do is cause the wood to expand. Then when you get it off the ground and use it, it's going to contract, and then you're going to start seeing some major problems as far as splitting, bowing, twisting, all the bad things we're trying to avoid. So keep it off the ground, keep it off the concrete. One thing I did before having any storage in the shop for lumber is I would just take some small scrap pieces and stack them on the ground, and then lay the boards that I wanted to keep on top of those. That gets them up off the ground, allows some airflow in there, and it prevents that from soaking any moisture off the floor. Number 3 on the list is avoid storing your lumber in direct sunlight if at all possible. Now, this shop has windows on the garage. There's also a window back here that I blocked years ago with a piece of styrofoam. You may have seen it in some older videos. And the reason I did that was to prevent that sun from coming in, because I used to store my lumber right here on the ground. And I didn't want that sunlight directly impacting or directly contacting my lumber, because when it does that, you're getting a few things. It's heating the wood up, which causes it to heat and cool, which is going to cause it to twist and bend. Also, it's going to dry it out and discolor it and cause it to be a different color than any of the other spots if it sits there long enough. If you store your lumber outside or in a shed or under a shed, be sure to cover that with a tarp or some plastic sheeting or something like that, just to keep the direct sun and the elements off of it. Number 4 on the list is not properly supporting the lumber while it's being stored. Now, when I first started, I again stacked the lumber back here behind me on the floor, and I supported that with several pieces of, say, scrap 2x4 or scrap something, and made sure I had several pieces along the way so that it was supported all the way across. So if it was 8 or 10 foot long, there may be 5 or 6 of those pieces perpendicular to the wood so that it's always supported. What I did was actually take some concrete blocks and put on top of my lumber stack to help weight that down, and that surprisingly kept anything from twisting and bowing as it acclimated to the shop. I highly recommend doing that if you're going to have lumber just hanging out. The main reason you want to support the wood or lumber across the length of the board is because if we take, for instance, where we're going to pretend my workbench is the ground, if you put a support here on the end and then another one here on the other end, and then you let that sit for a month, what's going to happen? Just the natural weight of this board right in the center, it's going to bow. It's just physics. It's math, whatever you want to call it. It's just going to bow. So on boards 5-6 feet, I would probably go ahead and put another 1 or 2 in the middle just to keep everything nice and equally supported all the way across. And another consideration is, like my garage floor is extremely unlevel. Over a course of 2 feet, it may drop 2 inches in some places. So you have to kind of take that in consideration when you're building your supports for your lumber. If you're stacking those on the ground, be sure to account for that unevenness in your garage floor if it's bad off. Now, one thing to consider is plywood really doesn't apply to most of this stuff as far as moisture is concerned, because it doesn't absorb the moisture, expand and contract like regular wood does. It'll absorb moisture, but it won't expand and contract. Now, it does need to be stored flat and or vertically straight up and down, because it will bow over time, especially if the humidity is changing and temperatures changing and things like that. But as far as it moving in and out, it doesn't do that. A little over a year ago, I started storing most of my lumber vertically. And the reason I did that was space saving. Now, when you do store it vertically, plywood, MDF, anything like that needs to be as straight up as possible without it causing any chance for it to tip over. And when you use your 1x, 2x, anything like that to store vertically, make sure it's well supported, because you don't want it leaning too far against the wall or it will have a tendency to bow. As long as you can keep it fairly straight up and support it. I like to use my plywood to support my 1x and things like that because it keeps a good flat surface. That keeps anything from bowing or twisting. And the same thing goes on the ground. I keep my lumber up off the ground with scrap pieces just to keep it from absorbing any moisture from the concrete. Vertical is probably my favorite way to store lumber. Another way I store lumber and keep it out of the way and keep it nice and flat and straight are lumber racks. I bought this on Amazon myself. I've actually got 2 of them. I'm going to install another one soon. This is a great way to support or to store shorter stock. In other words, 4 or 5 foot pieces. Most of my hardwoods I store up here. Walnut, maple, several other species. This was extremely easy to install. I mean, all you have to do is make sure you're getting into a stud because it's going to be supporting weight. So you want to make sure it's nice and secure. I was a little concerned at first that it wasn't going to be strong enough, but it's been up here for a couple of months now. 0 issues, and as you can see, it's stacked full of some really nice hardwood. I was also a little concerned with it only having 2 supports that it would bow or twist or cause the lumber to do that, but I have had 0 issues with that, and it's spaced out perfectly so that 4 or 5 foot pieces are supported nicely and they don't twist or bend. It's a really nice product from Bora, and they're very inexpensive, so if you're interested, I'll link a link in the description for that. Of course, there's also an option to be able to store your lumber on a cart that you can roll around your shop. The reason I never opted for that was I just didn't have space for it. Those things are going to take up quite a bit of space, and in a 2-car garage, I can't lose any more space than I've already lost to essential items like a miter station, a workbench, or even this storage unit behind me. So it just depends on your shop, your needs, on whether a cart would work for you. Another great option is storage shelves. For years, I used Husky brand shelves, and I was able to store my lumber on those shelves. They're nice and flat, they're well supported, and they're up off the ground. This is an excellent way to get your lumber off the ground and have a storage space for it. I used 2 of them for years, and it worked perfect for the shop. I highly recommend those shelves, and they're really inexpensive for what you're getting. Super well made and can hold a lot of weight. Number 5 thing you should always avoid is storing your lumber in a damp or humid place or environment. Now, sometimes that can't be avoided, especially if you live in the South like me, but again, adding a dehumidifier really helped that. Or just keeping the garage door shut will actually help that as well if you're able to. Now, if you're in an area where you can't, or you don't have the room to do that, or you don't have a space to do that in, storage sheds, things like that will also help. Just try to keep everything up off the ground and covered so that it's not damp or wet. For instance, my local lumber store, Barton's, actually stores all of their lumber outside. There is no indoor storage like you see at Home Depot or Lowe's, but it is covered. And for the most part, it stays fairly dry. Now, if it's really pouring down rain, I try to avoid getting lumber from there for a day or 2 after so it can dry out in that open air. But with it being covered with a light rain, it usually never gets wet. Of course, it is stored outdoors, so it's going to pick up some of that moisture from the outside air, especially when it's raining or damp. That's one of the reasons why we revert back to number 1. We let it acclimate. So if you pick up the lumber from the lumber store and it's damp, it's wet, it's been raining, bring it to your shop, let it sit for a week, if at all possible, 2 weeks. If not, minimum 48 hours, let it acclimate to the temperature and humidity in your shop. You know what time it is, power tip time. The reason we go through all of this trouble is to try to minimize wood movement. In other words, the bowing, the twisting, the splitting. Anything that's going to damage your project later, that's what we're trying to avoid by storing this properly and keeping it as dry as possible. With that said, don't be overly concerned with wood movement. It's, in my experience in the last 6 years of building things out of construction grade pine, building things out of hardwood, basically anything furniture-wise, end tables, dining tables, tabletops, breadboard ends. I've had very minimal movement in any of that. And when I say minimal, during certain times of the year, you can feel maybe 2 boards aren't perfectly lined up like they were when I built it. There may be a 1/64 of an inch that you can feel a little lip there. But for the most part, it's moving so small, so minor of movements over the course of months, it's not going to make that much difference. So don't go overboard with worry and concern about wood movement. The main thing we're looking for when we bring lumber into the shop is to keep it from bowing, moving, and twisting before you use it. Once you make your project with it, 99% of the time, it's going to be fine. I made this little end table several years ago, and this is construction grade lumber that I bought at my local lumber store. It's pine. I bought it, brought it home, and made it probably the same day or within a few days of buying it. So wood movement was never a concern, number 1, because this is such a small piece. Even on some of my end tables that we built over the years, I would buy the lumber that week and build with it. So wood movement is something that you think about, but don't not build just because you're worried about it. It'll be fine. I'm going to show you 5 tips to instantly improve your wood finish on your projects, specifically on pine projects like most of us use starting out. There's certain things you need to do to make sure you get that flawless finish. I recently built this table. It's all out of pine from Home Depot. Most of all my projects that I made on the channel have been out of pine. I built hundreds of these projects over the years, from stove covers to tables, and I've learned some valuable lessons on what not to do. And today I'm going to share with you those 5 tips. Let's go. Before I show you how to finish this table, if you want to build one just like it, I have plans available for this and many other things on our website. Go to 731woodworks.com/store and check those out. If you use the code FINISH, I'll give you 20% off any order, including these little table plans. And if you're interested in any of the supplies or tools you see used today, I'll put links in the description and the pinned comment so you can go check them out for yourself. Number 1, you absolutely have to make sure all of the wood glue is properly cleaned up. And we're going to show you how to do that. But I'm going to leave some of mine on there to show you what happens if you don't. So during assembly of the table, you may see glue squeeze out or something like that. You can see it here, but on sometimes, depending on the color of the glue and the species of wood, you may not see that squeeze out. But anytime you use wood glue and there's a joint, then you need to make sure that that's properly cleaned up. It's easier to clean up during assembly. Just take a damp cloth and wipe that off, and that will pretty much get rid of all the glue. And then also when you're sanding, you're gonna make sure that you get those spots. Another caution is sometimes you get wood glue on your finger and you hold the piece of wood, and whenever you go to stain or put your finish on, that's when you see it. A lot of times you don't see it before then, and that's when your heart just sinks. Just for demonstrations, I did put a little wood glue on my thumb and touch the side of the tabletop just to show you what it's gonna look like after we finish this. You're gonna see how that changes things when you put your finish on. Tip number 2, if you want to make this look very professional, like you absolutely knew what you were doing, is fill the knot holes and the voids in the wood before you sand it. This is really easy, and it's specifically made easy because of a company like Starbond. They have CA glues, which are basically colored glues that dry extremely fast. Now, I've used them on a ton of projects before. I've even made a couple of specific videos on how to use them, but I'm gonna show you really quick how easy it is and why you should do it. When picking out the color that you're gonna fill these knot holes, you need to know what color you're going to be staining with. Now, I know that I'm gonna be staining with dark walnut for the top, but if you're picking a lighter color, you may wanna go with a lighter colored CA glue. Or if you're just gonna be painting this, it really doesn't matter if it's clear or black or anything like that. The darker the color, the darker the wood glue. It'll make it blend and look more natural. This stuff is very affordable and very easy to use. We got a knot hole there. You can feel the crevice in there or the void. And all we're gonna do is squeeze that into that void. I like the medium thick for these purposes. It's not too thin, not too thick, Goldilocks, just right. Just gonna put a little dab on there. And then you'll also get some activator, and you'll spray that activator on there, and that's just gonna make that dry within about 30 seconds. We have several of these knot holes up here that we're just gonna do the same thing. This one actually goes all the way around it, so we'll just apply the CA glue around the knot. Now, one of the main reasons you wanna do that is to prevent that knot from working its way out later. I have seen that happen. You finish the project and that knot hole is actually loose and you don't know it, and then it pops out. You don't want that happening on your customer or on your project. So go ahead and, this is gonna seal those in. A little bit of this stuff goes a very long way. I'll drop a link in the description below to my favorites. Another good reason to fill knot holes is to prevent that from splitting as it ages. You can see that one has split in 3 different directions. This will just bind all that together and keep it from splitting out later. Number 3 on the list is sanding. Nobody likes sanding for the most part, but it's an essential step to get that perfect, flawless finish. We put that CA glue on there. We're gonna make sure that's nice and smooth. For the most part, on sanding, when you sand things, don't put too much pressure down on your sander because that will create those swirl marks that we all hate. And just make sure that you get all your saw marks and things like that off of there. If you don't, you'll see them, especially if you're staining, you'll see those saw marks left in the edges of your wood. On the edges of your wood, if you hit that with a regular sander, it's gonna deform that, especially if you've used roundovers. So I highly recommend using like a contour pad. This is the one I use, and it just basically forms around the edge of that profile so it doesn't damage it. It just sands it smooth. What I like to do after I get through sanding with my orbital sander is I'll take something like this sanding mouse and go with the grain just to give it a final sand at 220. I always sand with the orbital sander at 120. I rarely go above 120 on furniture pieces. But on the sanding block, I'll put a piece of 220 grit on there and just sand with the grain on all the surfaces. That just helps remove any of those sanding marks that may have been there. But if you use like a 80 grit, 60 grit, something like that, that's going to put a lot of deep scratches, especially in softwoods like pine. That's why I highly recommend staying at 120 grit or above. Another thing you want to be sure and look for are clamping marks. In other words, where you've clamped the boards down, you may see where your F-clamps have indented the wood a little bit, or any type of clamp you're using really, you'll see that circle or those half circles. You want to make sure that you get those sanded off, because if you don't, they'll absolutely show up in the stain, which I'll show you in a little bit. After you get through sanding, you absolutely want to make sure just take your shop vac or whatever and vacuum up any of the bigger loose dust you can get. And then I highly recommend a microfiber cloth like these. They're very inexpensive and they remove a lot of the dust that you can't see, and you will not remove if you just move your hand or a vacuum across the surface. You can see here how much dust came up just from the top. We'll wipe the whole surface down before we move on to step number 4. If you skip this part and if you don't remove the dust, especially from the top, when you put your finish on, that dust will get embedded into there and it'll be very difficult to get off later. In other words, when people touch the top of your product or your surface of your table, they'll feel that bumpy, gritty feeling. You don't want that. Step number 4, before you stain it, you want to wipe everything down with mineral spirits. This is also going to remove some of that dust from the previous step, but it's also going to reveal some things to you. A lot of times if you wipe this down, you'll see where you've got sanding marks, those swirl marks, and where you've left the glue, like you see here. This is 4B. This is still part of the staining process and essential on softwoods in my opinion. I've stained dozens of projects without this stuff and hundreds of projects with this pre-stain conditioner from Minwax, and this stuff works. Some people say this mineral spirits and this are the same thing, but I just disagree. What this will do is remove the blotchiness or the miscolorations in wood. A lot of times when you stain pine, you'll see some really nasty looking dark spots and things like that. This helps prevent that. It's a good idea here to put some gloves on. This is very simple to apply. You're just going to take a terry cloth and dampen it and wipe the entire project down. And this will take about 30 or 45 minutes to dry after you wipe it on, and then we'll move on to 4C, staining. And 4C, I think is where we're at. We're just gonna put stain on. There's no magic secret to putting stain on. I do recommend the best applicator for stain, in my opinion, are old t-shirts, like old white t-shirts, like undershirts, because they don't have any lint, things like that. A terry cloth also works well, which I'm using here. The only thing to be cautious with on terry cloths is sometimes they will kind of snag in any splinter that may be there. When applying stain to the underside where you have pocket holes, like in this project, the good old-fashioned Q-tip, aka cotton swab if you don't use Q-tip brand, you'll just dip it into the stain and then run it into the pocket hole. This is by far the easiest way to stain inside pocket holes, and I recommend putting stain in there. One, it helps seal it, but most importantly, it makes it look better to your customer if they ever look underneath the piece of furniture. That way it's just not an unstained piece there. As far as applying stain goes, I always like to put it on the underside first and then the top side, and then you'll want to let your stain dry about 24 hours before we move to the next step. Wipe it on fairly liberally. You don't want it pooling up. I think a lot of people make a mistake by putting too much stain on, and that's really not the purpose of stain. It's just to stain the wood. It's not really to flood the wood. It's not like an oil finish where you're dipping a cutting board or something like that into mineral oil and it's soaking into the grain for a period of time. That's not what stain is for. Stain is just to color the wood to the color you want. It's basically painting it, but not. And you may notice some dark splotches here, and that's what you'll see when you don't use pre-stain. Once I get it coated, I'll take a clean part of the rag and just wipe lightly any excess, and then we'll move on to the edges before we flip it over. I like these little Craig blocks because they have these little rubber nibs on there, and that prevents this from sliding around while I'm trying to stain something like this. Anytime you have a crack or a gap, you want to put a little extra in there and let that finish soak into that just so that it all colors it up right. Now this is extremely important, extremely important. Listen, do not throw this in a trash can or in the corner of your shop or anything like this. These can actually self-combust in the right conditions, so make sure to dispose of these properly. What I like to do is take an old stain rag, I set it away from the house, outdoors, for a couple of days, and then I discard it in the outdoor trash can. I do not put these in the trash can in my house or in the shop or just leave them laying around. Never do that with stained or oily rags. Now we just applied the stain to the top and we have a problem. Remember, I talked about sanding marks as well as glue marks. This is where you will see those. I bared down on the sander on purpose to show you what will happen if you push down too much pressure and you don't sand that off with that sanding block. You can see those little swirlies. That's from the sander, as well as on the same edge I did the same thing, and you can see those swirlies there. And while that's not a huge deal, it will hurt your feelings, especially if it's on a large project and you have a bunch of them. If you remember where I put my thumb in the glue and accidentally touched the top, then you're going to see that come out in a lighter spot in your stain. If you see this on any of your project where there's a light spot, that's wood glue. And that's what the wood glue has already filled the pores of that wood, and the stain couldn't soak in there. So you're going to see that lighter spot, and that's going to really hurt your feelings. Now you can fix that, but you have to sand off the stain off of that edge or wherever that glue spot is. If it's on the top, you have to sand that back off. If it's on the top, pretty much you have to sand a large area because you want everything to mix and blend back together. So in this case, this tabletop here, if I had a glue spot on top, I would sand the whole thing back off and repeat the whole staining process. For the edge, you can just sand this edge, then stain it again. When staining or painting the base, always turn it upside down and paint and or stain the bottom side, then we flip it over and do the top side. It's much easier that way. Now I've applied this lighter color stain to the base, and I can already see the flaws because the stain will highlight anything you've done wrong. There is a clamp mark. There is a clamp mark. You can also see the swirlies right there. And then if you'll take notice of the back side of these, I did not apply pre-stain conditioner. They're much darker and more blotchy than the front side. And now you can really see those saw marks that I was pointing out earlier. They were difficult to see before the stain was applied, but now that the stain is applied, you can clearly see them. And a couple of places that the glue wasn't cleaned up on purpose again. You can see right there that very light spot. Also, you might can see it right there along that crease or along that seam, but it really is pronounced here. The color isn't taking to the wood the same as the surrounding areas because that glue's blocking it. That's why it's so important. That's one of the main things that you have to do and have to look for when building stuff like this. It's just to clean up those edges. Again, a damp cloth, after you put everything together, just wipe it in that crease, it'll take care of it. You don't have to worry about it after that, but if you don't clean it up, or if you get some on your thumb and touch the project, then it's going to show up. Another thing you may notice are these horizontal lines that run down boards like this. That's the face of the board. Even on these raw 2x6s, that's what I use to build that. You can see those vertical or those lines on this one. I'm not sure how much it's showing up on camera, but you can see those there. That's where it was planed at the factory, and if you don't sand it, then it'll show up in your finish. Typically what I like to do is just spray the bottom first, and that's going to include the inside of all those legs and everything that I can get from this angle. And then after that dries, it only takes lacquer probably 5 or 10 minutes to dry before you can touch it. And then I'll flip it over and do the top side, and we're going to put about 3 coats of lacquer on there. The reason I like lacquer is because each coat bonds to the coat that you previously put on there, and it creates a very hard and durable surface. I used lacquer on my desk build that I did a while back, and it has held up extremely well, even using a mouse on there without a mouse pad. So that has wore very well. For a long time, I used to use polyurethane, specifically water-based polyurethane over oil-based stains. Yes, you can do that, and it doesn't hurt anything, so long as the stain cures about 24 hours. However, it takes longer for it to cure between coats, and it's a little harder to get a flawless finish like you can with lacquer. Lacquer is my favorite go-to finish of any finish that you can use on furniture, especially tabletops and things like that, because it's so durable, and for a beginner, it's very easy to apply. All you have to do is spray it on. Now, I like using these rattle cans for small projects, but I have used an HVLP gun with a little bit of lacquer mixed with lacquer thinner. I've got a video on that on my desk build. I'll link in the description, as well as a link to the polyurethane video if you like using that. So I like to put 2 coats of lacquer on, and I'm waiting about 30 minutes between each coat. And then before I put the final coat on, I'm going to take 320 grit sandpaper, very lightly sand the top of this, and just remove any bumps or anything that you may feel in that. And then we're going to wipe that down with a microfiber cloth. Then we're going to spray our final coat of lacquer. This stuff is so easy to apply. Anybody can do it. What you never want to do is spray lacquer in an enclosed environment such as a garage, which is why you see me outside. Fumes will come off of this thing, and it makes it very difficult to breathe, and it's quite dangerous actually. So don't breathe this stuff in without a respirator if you're going to spray it inside. I prefer to bring everything outside to spray it. A couple of quick tips on lacquer is you don't want to spray too heavy. In other words, don't make it pull up or drip. Now, all you're doing is putting a very light coat. I used to hold the can about 6 or 8 inches away, and then just make equal passes or even passes on there. Super easy to do, and it'll come out nice and flawless. Just don't stop and cause a puddle. Also, I'm using satin here. You can get gloss, but I prefer the satin. It just looks more natural. After the final coat, I let that dry for about 30 minutes before I bring it back inside. At that point, as long as the temperature is above 50 degrees, it should be dry. And you'll be able to tell if it's tacky or damp feeling or even sticky feeling. If it's not, then it's dry and ready to come in. Now wait about 24 hours before you set anything on top of that, like a cup or a lamp or a plant or whatever you've built this table for. Overall, the table looks fairly nice, even with the on-purpose mistakes that I put into this to show you what not to do. However, if you take the time and do it properly, it'll look that much better, which will command a higher price and make your projects look more professional. So the first and easiest method is to get you a 48-inch level. You can use this as a straight edge. This is a Stanley. I'll drop links in the description below to everything you're going to see today, so you can go get those for yourself. Now, if you got a level, 48-inch level, these are very inexpensive. This is an I-beam style level. Made out of aluminum. It keeps a good straight edge. I've had this one for a couple of years. So let's say we have this sheet of plywood, and it doesn't really matter how wide you're going to cut a piece off, whatever you need to do, but we're going to pretend it's going to be a 6-inch piece. So what I would do is I'd come over and measure a 6 inches. Now your circular saw shoe, or the bottom of it, is going to depend on what the distance away from the blade. So depending on what kind of circular saw you have, and the distance between the blade, the edge, or this edge will depend on how far over you're going to move this, right? If I was wanting to cut here at 6 inches, we know that from the edge over, you want to the inside of that blade, so I would be looking to the inside of the blade right there. Make sure that that's where I want it. Move that level over there, and then double check everything. Make sure that that blade is lined up. Once it's where you want it, you can take a small clamp it to your workpiece. Just snug. You don't have to wrench down on it because you'll wind up bending your straight edge. Or you could take some quick clamps like these, do the same thing. That'll hold it in place while you make cut. What I would suggest, what I do is I will take and measure that end. So you'll measure over from there to the edge of your plywood, to the edge of your level, to the edge of your plywood. This is 7 3/8. We'll go down here and make sure this is exactly 7 3/8, and then we would clamp this in as well, another small clamp. Clamp that in. Then we would take our circular saw, make our cut. This will be the guide. This would be exactly 6 inches all the way down. You'd make a good straight cut in your straight edge. Typically, you're not going to get a level that's over 48 inches long. You know that most sheet goods, plywood, are 4 foot by 8 foot. So this is great for cutting across the plywood. But if you have an 8-foot cut you need to make, I have something for that. This is a Swanson straight edge. It's about $40. This is a Swanson CG100. I'll put a link in the description below to this one. What's awesome about this is it's 8 foot long. It comes with 2 small clamps to clamp it down. It comes with everything you're going to need to cut a good straight line. It can also be used as a 4-foot section, just like this. So it breaks down. It has this piece here that goes into the channel. You can see that it is shaped to fit inside the channel. What that does is when you insert it into the other half, it has these thumb screws on there. You can just slide it inside the channel on the other piece until it lines up, and then you tighten these thumb screws down. When those are tightened down, you have an 8-foot straight edge. How awesome is that? So it's basically the same premise as the 4-foot. We're going to pretend my tabletop is a sheet of plywood. I don't have a full sheet here. You've probably seen me use this in some of my other builds. You can check out any of my plywood furniture builds on the channel. You can see me use this and some other methods. The way this works is this side is more raised than this side. So you have a thin side and a thicker side. This is about 1/4 of an inch tall, maybe about 1/4 of an inch tall. So that gives you a good flat surface for your saw to run down. You do the same thing. You're going to take the distance from the blade to the shoe, measure that over. These little clamps will clamp to the sheet of the plywood and to the flat side. This actually works a whole lot better than the level because the level has those 2 I-beam pieces and it sometimes makes it hard to clamp correctly. So if I was going to pick between a level and this, I would go with this because you've got 8 foot versus just 4, or you can just break it down and use 2 pieces as 2 4-foot pieces. It goes together simple. It breaks down for good easy storage. It's super straight. I mean, this thing is like arrow straight. So you clamp this end down, you would take the other small clamp it on the other end. I always lose my tape measure. Come on, man. So I said this is 8 foot. It's actually 8 foot 4 inches. What's awesome about that is you're going to have 2 inches of overhang on each side of your plywood if you're ripping a long 8-foot strip. So that gives you plenty of room for your saw to keep tracking after you get to the end of the plywood, and it gives you plenty of room to clamp with. I highly recommend, if you use sheet goods at all, pick one of these up. $40, but they work excellent for what they are. Like I said, they're straight. It helps you get good straight cuts. Once you get each end clamped, You got the distance measured off. Your saw will fit right up against that. It's actually about the same height as this saw shoe. So it's got a good flat surface to run up against, not so thick that it will interfere coming the other way with the motor. That's a good thing because sometimes that level with a clamp on there will interfere. But this is thick enough that it gives you enough surface for your saw to run against, but it's thin enough that it's not going to interfere with the motor. Coming this way, this is a super good way to get a good straight cut on plywood. Or a 2x8, 2x10, things like that. You actually use this to joint an edge of a 2x10 or a 2x8. Last but certainly not least is the Craig Rip Cut. Probably one of the best $40 I've ever spent is on the Craig Rip Cut. I like Craig products. They don't sponsor me. I just like their products because they're great for beginners and intermediate woodworkers. I've built tons of awesome looking furniture and projects using Craig products. I just like them. They work well. I mean, then they're inexpensive for what they are. This is a Craig Rip Cut. This will work with virtually any circular saw you have, no matter if it's corded or battery powered. It's so simple to get put in there. Let me show you. So all you do is you'll take your circular saw. It has these two. Come on over here, let me show you. It has these two basically screw clamps on there. So you just slide your circular saw right onto this mount. It has a stop block to tell you that you can adjust so that you can measure out and adjust it just right so that these measurements are correct. So you just flip this over. It's a Phillips head screws. Just snug them down with a Phillips screwdriver. Same thing on this side. So you just snug those screws down. I don't over tighten these, just snug holds it in there just perfect. So I'll make sure that the guard is raised side, make sure everything's unplugged, no batteries, nothing like that so you don't accidentally turn it on. Make sure it is square against this piece up here, pushed up against that stop block. If the guard is down, it'll actually interfere with it there. Once everything is squared up and touching this piece in the front, you just snug these screws down. Now it has this flip stop, flip that up, and you can move this circular saw. You can move it from 1 inch, and it has the guide with the mark on it to tell you how far or where you're cutting it. Slides on this track all the way out to 24 inches. Once you get it where you want it, you just flip this lock down and it locks it in place. It won't slide anywhere. This piece is lower than the rail, and so that acts as an edge guide. So if you're going to cut a 24-inch piece out of this plywood, this goes against the edge of the plywood. It has a handle for your hand to go in. You hold it against that edge of this plywood, and then all you would do, start your saw and just let it guide down that edge just like that, all the way down. You're going to have a perfect cut every time using this Craig Rip Cut. I've used this on dozens of projects to cut down sheet goods. Helps me get a good straight cut. The only tip I would give you is when you get close to the end of that cut, you need to be sure and hold this firm against the edge. You don't, it will actually walk just a little bit on you if you're not holding on to this edge really firm. If you're holding it firm, you have no problem. Just hang on to that. This thing works really great. So if you're interested in any of these 3 products, I'll drop links in the description below. They'll help you get good straight cuts, especially on your sheet goods. If you work with sheet goods at all, it's a great way to build different kinds of projects out of plywood. These things work really well if you don't have a table saw. It's a good option. Craig also makes one that goes up to 48 inches. I'll put that in the link description below. It's a little more expensive. I think it's $70 or so. This $40 Craig Rip Cut's probably my pick of the 3 options today. Second would be the Swanson straight edge, and then finally the 48-inch level. I've taken a trip to Working the Grain Hardwoods in Bentonville, Arkansas to pick up some supplies for the workbench I've got coming up. This is Mr. Mark Puente of Working the Grain Hardwoods.
Hi everyone.
He's going to educate us a little bit on coming to a hardwood store, or especially for me, it's intimidating coming to a store that you really don't know a lot about, and you're worried about, what if I look like a dummy, or what if I don't look like I know what I'm doing? I'm a woodworker, but I don't know everything there is to know about wood, because we can't know everything. Well, Mr. Mark's an expert. He's here to educate us a little bit about what we should do, some questions we can ask to kind of put us at ease at coming to a store.
Sure, absolutely.
One of the questions was, as a first-time customer coming into the hardwood store, what can they do to minimize the intimidation factor? Like, why is it so intimidating walking into somewhere to buy wood?
Well, I think a lot of times is because they don't know quite how to work with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I encourage to ask questions. We're here to help and answer those questions and guide. Ultimately, in the end, it enables the customer to come out with a finished product that they're happy with.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk through processes of gluing up and also finishing. So that information is valuable, where you can get it here within our particular business,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to go out somewhere and try to seek it online. It takes out the guesswork.
Right. Mr. Mark is an educator at heart, and He knows his stuff. And so if you have a question, feel free to ask him. You can email him or call him. He will answer to the best of his ability. But he'll also, if you have a question on if you're trying to build a certain project, whether that be a table or mallets or cutting boards or whatever, then you can help answer those questions versus what types of wood would be best or not used in a certain project. Right?
Yep, absolutely.
So somebody wanted to know the do's and don'ts of actually visiting the store.
I would say the don'ts are, don't feel intimidated. Ask the questions. If you're not getting the information that you need, that may not be the outlet for you to purchase from.
Right.
There are a lot of outlets available. The do's is keep an open mind. And oftentimes, a piece of wood will tell a story, the grain pattern and what you're looking at. For example, this mat right here, this is Cadillacs.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I saw a piece of that a while ago. I love that that's got that. It almost looks like a maple mixed with a walnut or a purple heart or something.
And the medullary rays and the formation here, plus the sapwood, it tells a story. And that's where you need to keep an open mind when you come into a hardwood store. This is something you won't experience in the home centers.
No, you won't. You're not getting anything like that in a home center. So one of the main questions I put it out in the community asking about coming to a store like this was, how do I calculate board feet? And so that was one of the most things, like it's so confusing to a lot of people on board feet. How do they know what to calculate? How do they know how to calculate it? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So most of your projects, Matt, let's start where you're buying wood from the home centers. And that's usually a 2x4. Which we know isn't really a true dimension of a 2-inch by 4-inch.
That's right.
But it was an industry standard that was started years ago when the mills finally said, we're going to have a full 2-inch by 4-inch and we'll construct it for houses. Over time, we were able to take that dimension down to 3.5 by 1.5 inches and then apply some type of a finish like drywall or paneling on the other side of it. So it's now set for houses.
That makes sense.
When you get into the hardwoods, we induct into a process called board feet. And that is a true 12 inches long by 12 inches wide. And to get a board foot, it should be 1 inch thick. And so if we take a look at this particular piece here, it shows just that. But let's say it's not 12 inches wide and it's truly 6 inches wide, it can still be a board foot if it's 24 inches long.
Basically, you took the 12 by 12 and stretched it out.
Absolutely. And so this would be considered a board foot, and so was the first example. Really, the calculation that you're looking for here is board foot. It'll be the thickness, 1 inch, by the width, which is 12 inches, by the length, 12 inches, divided by 144 for square area. Or if you want to do it by 12, you get your board foot area, and that is for your 1 inch thick.
So if I'm calculating board feet for a project, which of these two formulas would I use?
I would take the bottom. The bottom is the easiest to figure out.
So divided by 12.
Divided by 12.
So a lot of people want to know, if they come to the hardwood store to buy lumber, is it already surfaced 3 size, 4 size? Can you do that for them? How does that work?
Yes, absolutely. There are different grades of hardwoods. And when you come in, usually our product line here at Working the Grain Hardwoods is finished on 2 sides, straight lined on one side, and then it'll be rough on the other. So it would be an F3S.
So they can take it and only have to actually mill one side if they're making something small.
That's right. They can cut it down to size they need. It makes it easier for the customer to go ahead and handle that wood.
And I got a lot of questions on if they ordered from your website, which is WTGHardwoods.com. If they order from you on your website, how do they know that they're getting a quality board and not some scrap piece?
Absolutely. So wood is a product that's from nature, and it does have knots in it. And to get a quality piece of wood, you should have at least a clear section without knots that should be 66 inches at minimum. And so when they order something from us, we actually take the best part of the tree and that piece of lumber that they have, and we'll cut out that knot and then ship them what they are asking for. So we sell it by the board foot.
And you've got a description on how you actually get lumber from a tree, right?
Yes,
put together for us.
So this is a branch of a cherry tree, and this is the center, which is called the pith. And it is the undesirable piece. It's
the armpit of lumber.
That's right. That's right. And oftentimes, when a lumber mill cuts a log up, they will try to get rid of the pith and maximize the number of boards that they can get out of it. And their goal is to have as much yield as possible. So this is a flat sawn example, and this is a long board, and then this is the two sides that would be on either side of the pith.
So what, you got some stuff wrote on there.
That happens to be lilac.
Okay, so it's just the material
Correct.
or the type of wood.
And the date that this log was sawn.
So a lot of times when I know to my local lumber store, especially on spruce boards, you see that armpit, as I call it, the little circle, and then if you look on the face of the board, you see that brown streak that's darker than everything else. That's something you want to avoid, right?
Like this example right here. This is an example of what you're talking
Oh,
about.
yeah, perfect
right there's
example.
the pith. And in dimensional lumber, that will be included in, and this board will move.
Early on, I would buy those boards because it had the unique grain look on there, and it would be the first one that would split. As soon as I started messing with it, it would break right in half every time. I'm like, oh, I grabbed the wrong one again. So you got to avoid that. Another main question I got was beginner-friendly hardwoods. Would you recommend a certain species that they would go with if they're just starting out?
Yes, walnut is always a fan favorite. Everybody enjoys the color.
It's pretty. I like
Yes.
walnut.
The purples that you can get in walnut, the white, the contrast of the dark, deep browns that are available, and even sometimes a deep, almost black color. Contrasting to that would be your maple and cherry, which is the medium. It's much like what we have here as an example, the cherry. Those are our go-to boards that you would like to use for domestics.
One viewer wanted to know about spalted wood. Where does spalted wood come from?
Well, spalted wood is a process of decay in the wood. So it's actually had a chance to set for a period of time, and a fungus is actually growing through the wood. And it starts on the surface, and then it makes its way through into the wood itself deeper. If you were to plane away some of that spalting to dimension it, it would actually disappear unless it sat for a long enough period of time.
Really? I didn't know that. So it doesn't actually go all the way through and through. Well, ambrosia is not spalted in a way, right?
Yep.
I guess in a way it is, but in a way it's not. Or am I wrong?
No, ambrosia is from a beetle, and the ambrosia beetle and a fungus that it carries.
So it is fungus that kind of, as the beetle moves through, he leaves it behind, I'm
That's
assuming.
correct, and that happens in nature as a natural part of it. And so ambrosia maple, you don't know that you have it until you actually fall the tree and you're able to cut it up.
So they're just cutting the maple tree down, thinking they're getting maple, and they start going, I got this stuff.
Well, man, ironically enough, the same with bird's eye
Yeah.
and figured maple.
Wood changes in price. As you have to pay more or less, the prices go up and down based on the market. So people wanted to know about your price list and how they can get that price list.
And so if anybody wants a price list, they can simply email me
Okay.
and request one, and I'll send them the most
I'll put a
current one.
email right here on the bottom of the screen.
Matt, the hardwood industry is more stable than the commercial lumber industry is.
A lot of people was asking me about the futures of lumber or the futures. I was like, that's not hardwoods, that's construction grade lumber is what they're talking about in the futures of lumber.
That's right.
So the hardwood lumber stays fairly consistent. Back to the online ordering, I had one who wanted to know, they have a problem with trusting someone they're ordering from. Even some of the bigger retailers, when you're buying lumber online, you don't know what you're going to get. And we talked about that as far as you actually hand select what you're shipping to people. It's not just you grab it off a shelf and throw it in there, because you know what you've got. And if they're wanting a specific size or piece, all they have to do is tell you and you can help them pick that out. Probably send them pictures
Exactly.
if they want a specific grain pattern. Or
Yep.
I asked you earlier, but a lot of people want to know why Baltic birch plywood comes in 5x5 sheets.
And that's for the cabinet makers, Matt. They are able to make a 30-inch deep cut for a cabinet and then mirror it on the other side, so that is the perfect size for them.
My question then is, what about the blade kerf? Is it they're a little bit loud there?
There is.
Okay,
There is.
so it's actually a little over 5?
Yes, it's not a little bit over 5, but it allows for the depth, because most of the time you're putting on a door, and so that counts as part of the depth of the.
Not a cabinet maker.
There you go.
Somebody wanted to know what the strongest and the weakest hardwoods are.
So when we talk about hardwoods, we have to take a look at what's available domestic versus import, which they call exotics. And it's really determined by a Janka rating, which is a measurement that was developed at the turn of the century for determining the density of a wood. So the grain pattern and how tight it is, which is a part of that process of testing. We can see some woods in the world that are up to 3,000 Janka rating.
Be hard on the blade.
Yep, it'll dull a blade in a heartbeat. And then some that are as soft as being in the 700s and still considered to be a hardwood.
So a pine, where would it be rated about?
Pine would be in your 7 to 800
So
range.
it's really soft.
And because there's so many different types of pine
right.
that you have available. The harder pine, structurally rated, that you'd find in home centers would be your southern yellow pine. Softer one would be your white pine, the whitewoods we call it.
Where does walnut, Purple Heart, where do they rate?
American walnut will be in the 1200 range, and then you had mentioned another.
Purple Heart?
Purple Heart is a little bit harder. It's going to be up in the 1400 range, depending on where it's coming from.
One viewer say that they would gladly pay for a sample pack of little like offcuts or 6-inch pieces with a paper or some type of list explaining each wood and what they do. Do you have anything like that available, or would you put something like that available to them if they wanted it?
Yes, we offer sample packs that are available, and we'll ship them out. We also offer a variety pack, which we list the species of the wood on the end. On our website, we have the Janka rating for each one of the species, plus a picture of that wood. So they're able to get a general idea of what the grain pattern's like.
I have one want to know, what's the most fun wood name to say?
I think Choctaviga.
Choctaviga, I like that one. All right, we know you ship some woods. What's the maximum size wood you can ship?
It would be an 8-foot long board by 12 inches wide. That generally is the longest that we can ship.
So a lot of people who walk into one of the big home stores and everything's dimensioned for you, it's 2x4s, 2x8s, 2x6s, whatever. When you walk into a hardwood store, your terminology is different.
Correct.
Right. So if I want a 1-inch thick board, that would be
A 4-quarter board.
And you've got us an example here.
Correct. On the top line here, we have a quarter times a quarter times a quarter times a quarter, or plus, in this particular case, of language equals 4-quarter or 1 inch. If we were to go down to 1 1/4 inch, we would do that 5 times the quarter, 5-quarter or 1 1/4 inch. Same for 1.5 inch, which would be quarter times 6 equals 6-quarter or 1.5 inch. Over here, we have an example of what that looks like. This is a 4-quarter board, or 1 inch. This would be a 5-quarter. Then we have a 6-quarter and an 8-quarter.
It's all the way from 1 to 2 inches.
That's correct. Takes out the mystery of guessing what quarters mean.
Mr. Mark has a lot of good selection of woods, both domestic and exotics, and I'd like to show us around while we're here and show what you have available.
Absolutely, Matt. On this particular side of our store, we have the most amount of wood for domestic use. We have our walnuts, our hard maple, we have our white oak, flat sawn, cherry, soft maple, and also ambrosia maple.
I noticed, ambrosia's my favorite, you know that. I noticed that everything's vertical. You go to your, I don't know if this even makes sense, but you go to your home center and everything's laying flat and you got everything standing on end. Is there any reason? Is it just space, or?
It is for space purposes. We could lay them flat, but in hardwoods, the boards are different widths where they're more uniform in the home centers.
I got you.
So a 2x4 is exactly the same size.
So if they were all laying on top of each other, you'd have to dig through the stack to figure out which one you wanted to get, which width and all that.
We have our exotic section here, which is the heart of our store, and we carry woods that are from Mexico, also the Caribbean. We have some domestics here with our birch, and then we have some of our South American woods. We also have one from Africa,
What's that wood from Africa?
Iroko, which is a teak substitute, Matt.
And you was telling me that teak is actually on the endangered list, so that's why we have substitutes for it.
That's correct. Over here we have Purple Heart, Matt, and that seems to be a favorite for most.
A lot of people love Purple Heart.
Exactly.
Now you were telling me about, before we was discussing woods, you were talking about natural oils in the woods that would come out if you didn't do it a certain way, especially like glue ups.
That's correct. On our exotic woods, we encourage you to clean it up. Acetone is a good product to use before you glue up with a tight bond if you're making a cutting board, so that the glue adheres to the fibers of the wood.
Because if you don't clean it, plane it, sand it, something, if you glue it up, the oils actually break down the glue and can release.
That's correct.
On your cutting boards or whatever you're making. It's interesting.
We have Purdue from Africa. We have Cadillacs.
That Cadillacs is, I like that.
Amazing. Deep purples, medullary rays, and that's from
So
Mexico.
what would you make out of like that piece? What would you suggest someone if they come in and they like, I want that, but I don't know what to make?
That would be a beautiful musical instrument. It could be a cutting board or charcuterie board. It could be anything you really want it to be. Over here we have yellow wood, which is a substitute for yellow heart, called Mora. And then we have marble wood, which is from South Africa.
And you were telling me about marble wood, the reasons it's in thinner pieces or narrow pieces.
Yeah, because the tree doesn't grow very wide, and so it's a harder, denser wood, so you have to get thinner strips out of it. You need to glue up to make a longer, wider board. And then we have sapele here, and then African mahogany. We have leopard wood here.
Miss 731's favorite?
And then we also have black limba, and then we have shadua, jatoba, which is a Brazilian cherry.
Jatoba's pretty fun to say.
It is, and it's heavy.
Yeah, it's very heavy. It's very dense.
Next to it, we also have Peruvian walnut, which is from Peru. Wenge or wenge, whatever we want to call it.
I like Wingate.
Zebra wood as well.
Zebra wood's pretty. And you said it has the veins in there too, the little cracks, I call them. So they're veins. You would need to seal that with an epoxy or
stabilize
it somehow.
That is,
And then you also have blocks for turning.
yeah, pen blanks. We sell them for $2 each, and there's exotic as well as domestic woods that we have. So a lot of fan favorites like a sycamore,
Oh yeah.
which tends to have quite a lot of medullary rays in it.
When you say medullary rays,
Those are the grain pattern that you would normally see in like a white oak that's quarter sawn. This is natural in this wood. And so these are affordable if you're turning pen blanks. And this is one from one of the favorites from the 731. And
That
this
leopard
is
wood.
Leopard wood.
so I see like this here is like more elongated, where on the other side it's real tight. Is it just the grain or the way it's grown?
That is correct. So this would tend to be a quarter sawn piece where these rays are able to be showcased.
You also, this is something fairly new that we're talking about working a project together. You're wanting to put together bundles, especially for beginners or someone like me who's never made a cutting board, a woodworker has never made a cutting board, to actually be able to buy a bundle pre-cut with different strips, and then I can order these from you from your store or come by and buy these and be able to make a cutting board that's already, I can just rearrange these in whatever pattern my wife likes, right?
And designed to your favorite liking. And so as you put these together, they're dimensioned, so they're 1.5 inches. And this is edge grain, and the face grain becomes the side. So this would be 1.5 inches, and we have 1/2 inch, and then a full 1 inch pieces that are here.
What woods are in these bundles?
So this one here is a bloodwood, purple heart, maple, wenge. We have Paduke, another wenge, purple heart, Mora, yellow, and it just repeats the pattern.
This is maple, and then walnut, and what's this? These two.
Okay, this is cherry here, and this one is bloodwood.
And then this one's pretty striking too, but it's kind of similar to that, but the outside's different.
That's Paduke.
But you also sell glue and
Other products. For each one of the kits that we sell, we include a small 4-ounce bottle of Type Bond 3.
so that'd be enough for they could actually glue it up. All they'd need to do is clamp it, let it dry, and then sand it and put some oil on it.
That's right.
When the wood gets to you, it looks rough.
It's in the rustic state.
So it still has the edge, live edge on it,
It
things like
does,
that.
And it has saw marks on it, and we go ahead and plane it down and dimension it. We make it to a F3S and then also an F4S.
And you said some you can't, we talked about earlier, I don't know if we'll cover it on camera, but certain maples and things you don't actually want to send through a planer because it'll tear it out. The quilted maple and certain things, right?
We send that through correct. Because of the pattern that's in the wood, it would ruin it. So we actually sand that through a drum sander.
And you also carry plywood. Of course, you can't. I don't know that you could ship 4x8 or 5x5 plywood,
That's correct.
but you do sell it locally here in Bentonville.
We do.
And it's Baltic birch and walnut,
Cherry,
cherry.
and we also carry true maple.
As a beginner woodworker, it can be confusing and sometimes a little scary on figuring out which router to use and how to use them properly. In this video, we're going to go over everything you need to know about routers for a beginner woodworker. Let's go. Routers are some of the most versatile tools in a wood shop. It's probably one of my most used tools in the shop. I use one of these several times a week for various tasks. You can cut grooves in wood very easily and very accurately with a router like you see here, whether that be a straight groove or a dovetail groove for different purposes. And you can do what is the most common use for most routers, or edge profiles. In other words, dressing up the edge of your woodworking project so that it looks more professional. There's some dangers involved in using a router. We're going to cover that so you feel more comfortable and safer while you do it. But first, which router do you pick? There's so many out there, so many options. How do you know which one's right for you? There's basically two different kinds of routers you're going to be looking at, a fixed base or a plunge base. Sometimes you can get a combo fixed and plunge base, which I'd actually recommend for most people, but I've got some recommendations near the end of the video for both bits, accessories, and routers. For the most part, if you pick up a small router, these are called trim or palm routers. Both mean the same thing. These are small routers that typically go with your battery platform, or like this Makita here, which I really like. It's a very affordable, smaller router. Most of these are fixed base. While some of them you can get plunge bases with them, you're most likely going to buy them as a fixed base. And all fixed base means is it doesn't have a fast plunging option like this does. In other words, you set it and forget it and just use it like that. Now, a plunge base can be useful for various tasks. If you're just wanting to make several shallow passes at different depths, you can set this up to do that. The way a plunge base router works, it has this depth stop that is completely adjustable. If this is the highest setting we're going to go, we're going to back this off, and we want to turn this little dial to the highest setting. From there, we're going to lock this little pin on the side end, and then that's going to give us our highest setting. This is as high as we can go. So now every time we turn this dial, that gives us a 1/4 inch drop. And there's a positive stop there too. That allows me to plunge 1/4 inch. I can turn it again, I can plunge another 1/4. Turn it one more time, and I can, again, go all the way to the bottom or through the material, however I need to set that. So what I would do is set this high setting where this bit is just touching the surface of the wood I'm going to cut. That way, every time I turn that, we're going deeper and deeper. Similar to what I did when I put this play button in the middle of this workbench. I was able to cut that pocket out for that play button to go in just by taking small, shallow passes. That prevents tear out. It makes it easier on your router bit, and it just cuts better. Now, if you're needing to do fine micro adjustments to make sure you're not going too deep, you're going to use this setting here with the little flathead screw. This allows you to dial in the perfect depth that you need. Then I also use the plunge base to surface this so that it's perfectly flat with the rest of the table. And a lot of people use plunge bases to surface wood or flatten slabs, things like that. There's a multitude of uses for a plunge base, but you can do some similar things with a fixed base. It just depends on your use case and what you're going to be using them for. One thing I absolutely recommend, no matter which router you go with, is get a variable speed, because speed matters, and we'll talk about that when we get into the bits. A variable speed lets you turn down the speed that the bit is spinning, and you're going to want to make sure the router you're picking has that. Most routers do, but some, like this Ryobi that I have, are not variable speed. It's just a fixed speed. That works okay for edge profiles, but when we get into the bigger bits, you're going to want to speed those down a little bit. Nearly all of these routers have the option for an edge guide. Some of them come with edge guides. Edge guides are probably one of the more useful tools that you can add to the router. I would highly recommend, if you have the budget and it doesn't come with the router already, go ahead and add that to your cart. You'll use it all the time. That's going to help you create grooves and things that are offset from the edge, and it's going to keep you parallel to that edge. I use mine all the time. One thing a lot of beginners get confused on is what direction do you route in? If you think about a router bit similar to a table saw blade, or any blade really, the blade is spinning and cutting the wood because you're feeding the board into the teeth of that blade. A router bit is not that much different, as it has blades on it. No matter what style bit you're using, it's wanting to cut that wood. So you see when this one is spinning, you want to feed that board into the bit in most cases. On this board, for instance, we're going to be moving from left to right, and you're going to be pushing the router into the wood. You'll feel the resistance there. It's wanting to go back the opposite direction because it's spinning that way. It's like a tire on your car pushing your car down the road. This is very similar to that. It's wanting to push the router back to the left in this instant. You're just going to put a little force into it, hold it nice and snug, and you're going to get a nice clean cut in most cases. And I say in most cases because if the bit is chopping away at the wood and you see that wood grain right there leading out to the edge, sometimes that bit will hang in that wood grain and tear that wood or split the wood, especially like this. it'll likely split that from there all the way to the end. And the way you would prevent that is go the opposite direction I just told you not to go. It's called a climb cut. You're gonna give up a little bit of control because it's wanting to go that way, but you can certainly control it on edge profiles, chamfers, roundovers, things like that. So you'll just go with that edge. That'll prevent that tear out from happening. So when you're routing trays, boxes, cutting boards, anything like that, you're going around the outside, you're going counterclockwise around that piece on the outside. Now when you transition to the inside and you want to put a roundover there, you're going the opposite direction because that bit is contacting the wood at the opposite side. Then you would just go in a clockwise direction. That's still the push cut, as they call it, and not the climb cut, which it's wanting to go. Inside clockwise, outside counterclockwise. Basically what you need to remember. There's some common bits that most every woodworker is going to have in their shop. And they are. Chamfer bit, usually a 45-degree chamfer. In other words, it's going to put a 45-degree angle on your board. There's also roundover bits. I think an 1/8 and a 3/8 are two good ones to have in the shop. We'll talk about the difference in a minute. I personally love a dovetail bit because I make jigs with those, like my tapering and jointing jig and my crosscut slit. These are just handy to have. Flush trim bits are some of the most used common bits in most shops. What a flush trim does is create two identical pieces. Because that ball bearing rides on the sample piece or the template piece, then you can use those on templates, as well as just cleaning up the edge of work. Now, template cutting with these bearings lets you do several things. You can use jigs like this to create radiuses on the edges of boards using that flush trim, or you can go ahead and make the same thing over and over. So if you're just making charcuterie boards, you can just use a template to do that and make the same pattern over and over again. One of the great things about flush trim bit. And then straight bits help you do different various tasks, like cutting the dados or the grooves in this top where I put the T-track in, or cutting slots and things like that in boards. Straight bits are awesome for that. Most all of your routers are going to have some type of adjustment. This is a fixed base router, and the way it adjusts the height is this ring twist up and down, and it allows you to kind of micro adjust that. Different routers are going to work different ways. Like this Milwaukee, it has this little thumb knob that is gear driven, and it allows it to raise and lower the bit. When you're setting up your edge profile bits, like your roundovers and your chamfers, the way I like to set mine up is, you see how the bit is sticking all the way past this base. Then I just use this ring or the dowel just to dial that up until you no longer see the flat edge of that bit right there. Once that's past the base, you can lock that in and make your cut. It should come out nice and clean. I always recommend using, especially if you're a beginner, just use a scrap piece to make sure that's going to come out correctly. What happens if it's not set correctly, if it's, in other words, sticking past the base too much, you're going to wind up getting that nice little flat edge there, and it's not going to look that great, unless that's the look you're going for. If you wanted a nice, clean look, like this chamfer bit is set correctly here on the right, it's incorrect on the left. You can see that ledge. This is a nice, smooth edge. Same thing's going to happen with a roundover bit. It's going to create that ledge. Sometimes you want that look depending on what you're doing, but for the most part you don't. Now the difference between an 1/8 and a 3/8 inch roundover is subtle, but it is useful in certain situations. Like this guitar tray we make here at 731. This bottom edge is a 3/8 inch roundover. This top edge is a 3/8 inch roundover. However, the inside edge is a 1/8 inch roundover. It may be hard to see on video. It is subtle, but there is a difference there. 3/8 is just a little bit more of a roundover radius than an 1/8, but it is useful for various applications, depending on how much roundover you want. Hey, it's Future Outlaw. Past Outlaw was wrong, and I'm here to correct him. I told you that this was a 3/8 and this was an 1/8 inch roundover. That is incorrect, and I'm here to fix myself. What these are 1/8 and 1/16 inch bits. You can see the kind of a minor difference there, and this is a 1/8 and a 1/16 inch roundover. A 3/8 inch roundover is much more significant than the 1/8, as you can see here. Back to Past Outlaw. Now when installing your router bit, what I like to do is leave about a 1/4 inch or maybe 1/4 to a 1/2 inch sticking out of the router itself. And then when you tighten that down, some of these routers have a push button that locks this in place. Then you can take the wrench and loosen and tighten that nut. Some routers use 2 wrenches, one to hold this spinny thing from moving and another to loosen and tighten the nut. Router bits usually come in 2 different sizes, 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch shank. Now it depends on which router you have as to which one of these options you will pick. Now if you have a 1/2 inch, I recommend getting 1/2 inch bits anytime you can, but a lot of these trim routers only accept 1/4 inch and not half. However, similar to this DeWalt, it has both a 1/2 and a 1/4 inch collet, is what they call where it accepts the bit, is the collet. They have both 1/2 and 1/4 inch, so you can use either. Now when selecting router bits to your shop, it depends on the budget you have. My personal favorite is Whiteside. I buy those bits myself and use them all the time. They last a long time, they're well made with high quality materials. This is a nice set for about $100 and these last a very long time. I use them all the time. That is a very good beginner set for most people. Now before I get into the accessories I think are very useful to have with routers, let's talk about what router is best for you in your shop. First and foremost, if you're in a battery platform, it's very convenient to go ahead and pick up the router of your choice. For most beginners, if you're on a budget and you just need a router because you want to put roundovers, chamfers, edge profiles on your work, this little Makita 1 horsepower Colt is an awesome little router. It's variable speed, has good power to it. It's going to last you a long time. I love this little router. However, if you're already in a battery platform, a good trim or palm router in that platform is going to be what you want to look for. Just make sure you get the brushless line and that it's variable speed. Brushless motors on these cordless tools will give you more battery life and more power. By far, my #1 pick for most woodworkers starting out is something like this DeWalt. If you have about a $200 budget, you get a plunge and a fixed base, and it's a very powerful router that's going to do most anything you're going to want to do with the router. It's a little bit bigger, so edge profiles aren't as easy to do with a trim router, but it will still do them and do them well. There's also a Bosch model that's under $200 for the most part that has both the plunge and the fixed. I use it in my router table. It's about the same horsepower. I think these are both 2¼ horsepower. They're both excellent routers and will last you for years to come. Either one of those, depending on your color choice or brand choice, would work great for you. I'll link to both of those in the description and the pinned comment so you can find them easier. Now, why would you want a router table in your shop? Well, a router table opens up a whole new world of things you can do with the router. This is a skill router and router table combo, recently reviewed on the channel. You can go check that video out. I'll link it up there, I think. You can go check that out after this video. This is a really nice router table for beginners, about $200 or under, depending on the sale. A few things a router table allows you to do. #1, small parts like these boxes, trays, things like that are much easier to put that edge profile on there because you got that flat surface to work on. You're going to get a nice consistent round over or edge profile on cutting boards, any kind of boards or anything you're making like that, picture frames, stuff like that. It's a really nice way to do that. You can also set up stop blocks for different things, like making grooves or slots in wood like you see here. It's just a really nice way to do things. Or you can just cut 90-degree grooves across boards using a little push stick or a miter gauge or anything like that. Also, cutting out templates and things are much easier on the router table. You also get better dust collection on the router table versus what you get on a handheld router. All in all, if you have the budget for a nice router table and router combo, these are nice to have. Hey, I'm Matt. Today I want to talk to you about 5 mistakes you gotta avoid when you build your workbench. Well, at least 5. I may throw a bonus or 2 in there. And if you stick around, I give you a price breakdown on how much I spent on this massive workbench. One of the best things I've done starting out as a woodworker was to build a workbench, a proper flat surface to start building things on. That made a huge difference in my woodworking journey, especially early on. Even if it's a smaller workbench, which we'll get into later, it was great to have that space. It really changed the way I did my woodworking because it gave me a flat level surface to be able to work off of and to reference on. And that's the #1 mistake you need to avoid, is to make sure that the surface is not only flat, but level. Let me tell you what I mean. My garage floor slopes at least an inch all the way to the back. That wouldn't necessarily matter if all 4 feet were the same distance off of the floor. But you see here why I put riser feet on my workbench is because if I just put rollers on there, then the actual workbench would be twisted like this because of the way my garage floor is sloped. My garage floor actually slopes toward the house. Why somebody built it that way, I don't know. But it slopes toward the house, but it also slopes toward the back left corner. So it's basically a 2 slope. And so you could tell that the far left corner on the workbench is much higher off the floor than the far right corner. That makes a big difference. If I had just put the thing on the floor, it would be twisted. And that's gonna matter on drawers, opening and closing properly. It's also gonna matter on the top, which is what matters the most, is when you start assembling things, if it's not flat, you got problems. What you'll wind up with is you'll assemble a piece of furniture upside down, usually is how a lot of people will assemble it. When you flip it over onto its legs, it's gonna be wobbly and you're not gonna know why. Now, if your garage floor is perfectly flat, then you can get away with just having all 4 feet on the floor or even on casters, so you can roll it around. which my previous workbench did have it on casters and I could move it around. So much more room for activities. This video is brought to you by 731woodworks.com. Go check out our online store. We have easy to follow build plans to help you create awesome projects. We also have physical products as well as some merchandise for you to check out there. Anything you purchase from that store directly supports us and we appreciate it. Number 2, height. I get a lot of questions on how tall should your workbench be. That's quite personal because of people's different heights and things and where you're comfortable working at. What you really need to consider is if it's an outfeed table for your table saw, you need to have it either slightly lower or at the same level. If you don't take that into consideration and you build your workbench that's taller than your table saw, then you can't use it as an outfeed table because when you start pushing things off of the saw, it's going to hit the table. I personally prefer that my table saw is slightly higher than my workbench. What that allows for is when I cut multiple pieces of plywood like you see here, I'm able to cut one piece, it falls onto the table, then I can cut another piece and it actually is level with the saw at that point. The perfect height of a workbench doesn't exist. It just doesn't. So you got to figure out what's comfortable for you to work at because some items or some projects you're going to be working on, you would like to have them raised a little bit. Some projects you would like to have them lower, especially if you've got a tall project you're working on up high. The average workbench height is from 34 to 36 inches. Most counter heights in your house is about 36 inches. You can walk up to your counter now if you don't have a workbench you've already built. You can go in there and figure out if that's how tall you want it. It's going to be yay high. I'm 5'11". This workbench is just shy of 34 inches. It's probably about 33 inches right now. Number 3 mistake you need to avoid is building the workbench too small. When I built my very first workbench, I actually built it too small. It was about 3 foot by 4 foot with just a sheet of OSB. I went cheap on the materials and was able to make that workbench work for me for a little while, but the actual top was too small to build many projects on. I actually wound up expanding it out to 3 foot by 5 foot. That worked well for quite a while. However, this is a 4 foot by 8 foot workbench and I had some people tell me that it was going to be too big. I wouldn't trade this for a smaller bench. This is the perfect size. Now, sometimes it does get cluttered because you're bad about leaving stuff laying there because it's not in your way now. It'll get cluttered at times. However, being able to spread out projects on this workbench, big projects, I really enjoy that. So that's one of the things I would caution you on is it depends on your space, obviously. So if you're working in a smaller space, then your workbench will be smaller. If you have room for a bigger workbench, go big or go home. So the number 4 mistake I made when building this workbench was I wildly underestimated how much it was going to cost to build it. Hey, if you like this video, click that thumbs up for me. It helps me a lot. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click the bell icon next to it so you get notified of all the new content we've got coming. So for plywood, it actually costs $629.91. As far as the ambrosia and walnut, that was donated by Working the Grain Hardwoods out of Bentonville, Arkansas. Thank you, Mark. If I had to purchase that, I had 35 board feet of walnut at $8.25 a board foot. That would have come out to $288.75. On the ambrosia maple, I used 10 board feet. That's $18 a board foot, which comes out to $180. On the drawer slides, I actually had some left over, so I used them on my router table build. However, to get all the drawer slides I needed in one order, I had to buy some extra because they come in packs of 10. So I actually spent $260 on drawer slides. For the drawer pulls, they were like 30 bucks. One of the major expenses was the T-Track and the T-Track hardware. I actually spent $345.85 just on T-Track. That stuff's very expensive. As far as the T-Track accessories go, I bought some from Rockler and I bought some from Armor Tool. I got everything I could think of that I would need for this workbench, and that actually come out to about what the T-Track cost, which was $345.32. I spent $50 on leveling feet because I needed 6 and they come in packs of 4, so I had to buy 2 packs at $25 each. The YouTube play button that I put in the center, of course, a lot of people's not gonna use something like that or put that in their workbench, so you wouldn't have that expense, but that cost me $150 because they give you one and then you can buy extras after that and they are $150 each. The epoxy I actually sealed the play button in with would have been $61.99, but thank you to Total Boat for donating that for the video. So the total cost of everything, the value of the workbench is $2,341.82. What? That is a massive amount of money for a workbench. Minus the gifts, which totaled up to $530.74, which was the ambrosia, the walnut, and the epoxy. We're looking at $1,811.08. That's how much out of pocket I've got in this workbench. A couple of reasons why I did it. One, I wanted to make an awesome video, and that was just, it was a vision I had, and just I wanted to try to make it come true. I also wanted a nice workbench to be the centerpiece of the shop for the channel so that it could be shown over multiple months or hopefully years to come. So myself and Miss 731 decided to go all in on this project. It was the first and so far the only project we have went all in like that on, and just basically said, we're gonna put whatever we can into this to make it the most awesome project I can do. I know that it's shop furniture and it's gonna get beat up and banged on, but at the same time, I just really, really like it. Number 5 mistake to avoid on your workbench is, stick around for bonus content after number 5. The number 5 is finish. What finish you're gonna put on it. So I actually use Watco Danish oil. If you've watched the workbench build, I'll drop a link in the description below to that build. I use this Watco Danish oil to put on the whole thing except for the top. I really regret doing that. The reason I regret, it's a good finish, I've used it on other things before. The reason I regret using it on the workbench is it left a sticky film on there that just wouldn't dry. But as you can see, it's been a couple of months since I've had this. Sawdust sticks to it like crazy. It's dry, but it just makes it, stuff just sticks to it more than say Odie's oil. I use Odie's oil on the top and the trim, and the sawdust doesn't stick to it like it does the Danish oil finish. Just be cautious of what finish you use. A lot of people would just use clear polyurethane, a water-based polyurethane that'll work just perfectly fine. Some people don't put any finish on there. And then I really like Odie's oil. It lasts a very long time. A little bit goes a very long way. I use it on all kinds of stuff too. It's food safe, so you can use it on cutting boards, things like that. And I also use it on all my trays, mallets. It's just a good finish. I'll give you a couple of bonuses to avoid on your workbench. Number 1 is storage. What do you want to do about storage on the workbench? My first workbench was just an open shelf on the bottom, and I just threw some old toolboxes under there. Meh, you know, if it's an open shelf, it's gonna collect crap. On this workbench, I put 2 shelves in the back for storing jigs. That's the main purpose. I actually made them 36 inches wide so that it would accept my crosscut sled. And while it works perfect for that, it's got a great place for my crosscut sled to go. I can also store my jointing jig and other things under here. Even the mini workbench I can store under here. However, and that's a big however, if you have, you know what happens with shelves, right? They get packed full of whatever you can stick under there. So I would probably caution you into building more drawers versus shelves. While drawers can still be junk drawers, collect a lot of crap, I seem to be able to keep more things organized in a drawer versus on a shelf. And if you just pack everything into a drawer and shut it, then it's just there. If you pack everything onto a shelf, it seems to just fall out in the floor at times. Bonus number 2 to avoid on a workbench is make sure your joints are square when you glue it up or when you screw it together, however you're joining your workbench together. This is pretty minor. However, if you can look right there, I didn't get the clamp squeezed tight, and you can see that the joint isn't actually touching at the top, but it is at the bottom. And that was a very long stretch that I was trying to clamp together. And that was one of the issues that I had, was I didn't have clamps long enough. I tried to hook 2 together. And so you'll notice it's a little off going down. It's very minor. It doesn't hurt the function of the workbench. All the drawers open properly. Everything moves properly. It's just a little out of square. I saw it when it was coming together that it wasn't perfectly square, but it was just so minor that I was like, it's not gonna hurt anything. The only real issue it causes other than aesthetics is that I had to trim one of the drawer faces down a little bit so that everything fit properly. It's just one of those things where if it was too bad out of square, it would start affecting the way the drawers fit in the hole, because if you're out of square this way, then it's gonna be more narrow at the bottom than it is at the top, and it's gonna affect how the drawers operate and all that. Thankfully, it wasn't too much, but just be careful with the squareness of your workbench. I'm at 731 Woodworks. Today we're here with Mr. Mark Puente from workingthegrainhardwoods.com. We're going to talk about the 5 mistakes to avoid when buying hardwood.
Thanks,
How you,
Matt.
Mark?
Good. How about yourself?
Good, man.
It's been a little while.
It has.
It's good to
Thank
be
you for
back
coming.
here with you.
He's down in 731 land now. This video is brought to you by 731woodworks.com. Go check out our online store. We have easy to follow build plans to help you make awesome projects.
So, Matt, when we talk about hardwoods, we have to talk about all woods, right? We're just talking about a specific hardwood. We think because it's hard, it's not going to have the same characteristics as soft, but they do. And so some of those points that we need to consider is grain pattern matters. And when we take a look at some of our straight grains, like this piece of walnut here, we think, well, it's nice, it's elongated, I'm not going to have any troubles with it, but all wood moves. And so when we look at hardwoods, we want to make sure that we take a look at that grain pattern and take into consideration where it might move. So some of those areas that we will see movement will be right here at a knot hole, or the possibility of any other checked areas that we see here.
When you say checked, what do you mean by checked?
Checking is a natural process, Matt. When the wood begins to dry out, it'll crack. And all woods crack. They move. And so typically we'll see cracking happen at the end grain of a piece of wood. And so we'll see it right here. And that is because the end grain, which is here at the end, is drying out quicker than the rest of the wood in the face or the rest of the field. And so it'll crack in those areas. Take that into consideration when you buy hardwoods and make sure you get enough extra so you can combat that edge grain.
And you were saying earlier that a lot of woods that are stored vertically, like on concrete.
Yes, because that edge grain is like straws. They'll suck up any moisture that you have on the floor in your concrete area, and moisture settles. It's in the air, but it eventually settles down, and it'll find its way into your wood. So if you can, put a buffer in between it. A piece of rubber mat will work fine, or actually sometimes plywood you can set down there. And then we also talked about what type of considerations with hardwoods. And most of the time when we think of hardwoods, we think of kiln dried. And so, yes, that does stabilize it and bring down the moisture content of a piece of wood to about 7 to 9%. However, there is still moisture, and you'll have some movement in there as it acclimates itself to this environment. Now, Matt, you're getting ready to do a great project here, and you're going to take this walnut and you're going to make it into a tabletop.
That's right.
So you're going to do some gluing. You're also going to be doing some pinning, right? What is your process that you're going to use?
Dominoes, most likely.
Okay. So dominoes will help stabilize some of the movements on the edge grain. So when Matt glues the edges together, he's going to want to make sure he starts with a true area. If he uses this cracked area, it will crack. It will continue to crack, and it'll find its way all the way to the end of the board. So you'll want to trim and work around that area. Also taking into consideration with your movement is air dried is perfectly fine. We started out years ago with air dried species of wood and we made furniture out of it. So what's the big to do about kiln dried? Well, kiln drying takes away some of the pitfalls that we have, such as bugs. And in here, this is called ambrosia beetle, and it's from the fungus that comes through. And so by kiln drying this, it kills off any of those bugs in those areas that would be left behind. So you get a species of wood that should be somewhat fungus free, and then also in addition to it, stabilized with a lower percentage of moisture content.
Is there bugs still in here?
No.
Dead ones?
No, they're gone. Yep, they vacated their home, but they sure left behind a pretty pattern, didn't they? And that is really a choice piece of wood to find that.
And this is, what kind is this?
This is ambrosia, and this is called ironwood, and it's a native species of Arkansas. So that brings us to our next tip here, Matt. Embrace the imperfection of God's renewable resource. If you get a knot hole or these little holes here from a beetle, or even a check mark from another piece of ambrosia maple that we have here at the end, Matt, you can see that?
Looks like a pitchfork.
Stabilize them. Use that piece of wood. Don't throw it away. If you can put some epoxy into that area, or actually put a filler in there that you want some type of opposing color, contrasting color, this wood is still usable. Don't throw it away. It'll bring a lot of character to your work and make it more creative for you. So in some of the straight grains like this Purple Heart, you'll find cracking, and that's going to happen because it's such an elongated grain that it dries out at a different rate. It's okay if it happens. You'll just have to make sure that you watch out for it. And you'll see early indications that that's going to happen through the end grain itself here.
So keep an eye on that end grain when you're picking it out.
End grain tells the story. It really does. So when we go to a lumber yard and our hardwood distributor, sometimes you'll see markings at the end of the wood. They'll be colorized, and we have that here. Let's take a look, Matt. We can see that the color of this end grain is green, but we still have a check mark here. Sometimes lumber yards will mark it because of the species, but it's also to help with that checking. If you seal up that end grain, it's less likely to get moisture into those straws that are here at the end. One consideration when working with hardwoods is you want to make sure you take a look at the end grain patterns. These smiles and then frowns are important because they will move. And so to combat the overall movement of a glued up piece, whether it's a cutting board, tabletop, or it's just an art piece that you want to hang on the wall, is you want to make sure that you cup one direction, as this is a smile. The very next board next to it should be a frown. When gluing this together, it helps from the movement. And of course, if you were to glue on here, it would be the same hills and valleys that you'll want to repeat. That'll help stabilize your wood.
If I was to glue this board up, both frowning or both smiling, what would happen?
It would cup downward.
Like that?
Correct. You would think that it would cup with the ends going up, but actually it wants to go against that. It'll come down.
So I get a lot of questions about that. I get somebody will email me a picture of their tabletop that they glued up the night before. They come back the next day and it looks like that. It is, both sides are off the table that they left it on.
So most of the time, Matt, that can contribute to either a high moisture in the air or that the wood did not have enough time to acclimate. Or when they clamped it up, they did not put cauls on it to keep it flat. And that's just as important, making sure that you're registering off of a flat build space. That build space area, like the table that you have here, is very key to making furniture and making sure that it's registering off a level area.
So when somebody brings like this walnut into my shop now, how long would you suggest I let that sit in the shop and acclimate before I start cutting and milling?
So if it was air dried, I'd say that it would need to set longer for it to acclimate to your space. But this is kiln dried product, and so probably 24 to 72 hours time frame. Sometimes you'll get a rain pattern that'll happen in between those 3 days, 1 to 3 days. And so you would want to set for a little bit longer. Buy yourself an inexpensive moisture meter. You can get them online through Amazon. That will always tell you what's going on. It won't always tell you what's happening in the core, but it'll tell you what's happening on the surface.
I'll put a link in the description below to a moisture meter. And I've got a dehumidifier over there that it won't let it get over 45% humidity in here. If it goes below that, it doesn't run. So it may be 25%, but if it goes over that 45%, then it'll kick on and keep it at a regulated humidity in here. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Also, air conditioning your space helps keep the moisture down. Now, you have a large garage door in your area, and so it will exchange the air outside, which has a high humidity rate.
So I don't open that unless it's absolutely necessary.
So when you do that, you want to make sure that you just give your wood enough time to get acclimated to the space, rest, if you will.
Awesome. So Mark is with workingthegrainhardwoods.com in Bentonville, Arkansas, and he does ship hardwoods nationwide for lower 48.
Yes.
So if you're interested, give him a shout or look on his website. They've got cutting board kits. They've got all kinds of species of hardwoods that you can choose from, exotics and domestics. And this is where I buy my hardwoods, and I highly recommend. Excellent customer service and just an all-around nice guy.
Give us a call. We're glad to help you.
Thank you, Mark.
You bet, Matt.
Number one on the list, Purple Heart is one of the most beautiful woods you can use for cutting boards, mallets, and a whole variety of other projects. But when you start sanding Purple Heart, it doesn't stay purple. It starts turning a kind of a weird grayish brown color. I'm colorblind, don't hold me to that. However, there's a simple way to bring back that purple. All you have to do is take some acetone after it's sanded, wipe it down, set it in the sun for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then repeat the process until you get to that dark, deep purple color that you want and love. I learned that little trick from James King. If you've never seen King's Fine Woodworking, you got to check him out on YouTube. I'll link to his channel in the description. Number 2 on the list, sorting your sandpaper can be a pain in the rear if you don't have it properly sorted so you can find it easier. This is just an art bin box. In other words, an art supply box. You can get them on Amazon. I'll link to this in the description. It's about $30-ish. If it's much more than that, then don't buy it. They're trying to rip you off. About $30-ish is all this should be. But I've got mine sorted as you see here. 120, 220, 320, 60, 80, even the small sanding blocks that go with my Milwaukee. This is just a great way to keep it sorted and in place. And this is easily stackable or just throw it on a shelf somewhere. Shout out to All Red Woodworks for letting me know about this little dude. Be sure to stick around after number 5. I got a bonus for you beginners out there. Number 3 on the list, a lot of us have these brass setup bars in the shop to help us set up different things, routers, table saws, all kinds of things. A lot of them only go down to an 1/8 or a 1/16, but most of us have business cards, and if you can stack 2 business cards together, that gives you 1/64 of an inch. If you stack 4 together, that gives you 1/16 of an inch. You're welcome. That little business card nugget was sent in by a viewer, Steve Hawkins. Thank you. And as a side note, these little reference cards are handy as a shirt pocket. Pick up a set, I'll link to those as well. Next on the list, if you cut a lot of plywood or just cut plywood every now and then, you know how expensive that stuff is, and wasting it is a pain because it's going to cost you some extra money. But if you go to cutlistoptimizer.com, there is an absolutely amazing tool that's free to use to help you lay out exactly how to cut this plywood so that you don't waste a single piece of it. All you do is put in your measurements. So for the stock sheets, in America it's 96 by 48 as far as 4 foot by 8 foot sheets of plywood go. How many of those sheets you're going to use. If you have half sheets, you can do 48 by 48, whatever you have. And then on the panels, you're going to put what you're going to be cutting out of there. So if you bought some woodworking plans, like 730woodworks.com, you can go and get those measurements from that plan, put them in. It'll show you exactly how to lay this out on your plywood to make those cuts. And you can even include the kerf size. So if you know that your blade is an 1/8 inch, you type in 0.125. And when you calculate it, again, it's going to take into account you've got your blade kerf. That way you waste 0 parts of that plywood and it saves you a ton of money and time. Next on the list, if you're making cutting boards, this is an absolutely amazing tool to help you lay them out and figure out how much you're going to be charging for this cutting board. Check out the cutting board calculator website. I'll link to this exact website in the description. No affiliation, it's just an awesome free tool. You'll put in the length of the board you're going to be using, in my case 20 inches, and then of course how thick you want that to be at the end of this. You're going to use your blade kerf, and then you can add different woods. On this one, just an example, cherry, walnut, purple heart, and maple, and give it however much board feet you've got in this. In other words, if you're paying $10 a board feet, $11, whatever you're paying. Next, on the arrange the layout section, you can just play with this here and it's going to arrange the layout of your cutting board based on what you've given the information. So if you want to mix and match to see what things might look like on your cutting board that you're making, this is how you do that. It's going to let you adjust the width of each piece. So if you're going to make 2-inch pieces, 1 inch, half inch, however you want to do your cutting board. It'll also show you different designs like zigzag, checkerboard, spirals, all sorts of things. There's also a guide to help you use this tool on their website. You just click right there where it says need help using this tool, and then there's a whole basically instructions on how to use it. Absolutely awesome if you're making cutting boards. Before we move on to the next tip, be sure and smash that subscribe button. Click the bell icon next to it so you get notified of all the new content I've got coming. And another free website you can use is a place called blocklayer.com. This is absolutely awesome if you're wanting to build a deck, lay out a gazebo, any large construction style project. And there's also general calculators on here where you can basically calculate feet, inches, cubic feet, anything you want to. This is the go-to website to calculate any type of construction work. The great thing about this website is if you're doing a deck, say, it's going to show you where to put the post, all the cross beams, everything you need to make sure it's structurally sound. That's one of the main things I love about this. And you can resize everything to make sure it fits exactly where you need it to fit in your space. And of course, if you ever find yourself building stairs or anything like that, there's also a section there to help you build those, get the right angles, everything. There's more stuff on this blocklayer.com than I can even express in a video. Go check it out for yourself. You'll use it all the time. And if you just like having a physical calculator, this one here works awesome for just getting feet, inches, down to the 16th or 64th or 32nd or however you want to calculate it. And it does a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't know how to use, but I use this one in the shop. Listen, I know this is outdated and just ancient to have a physical book around your house. However, I'm a little bit old school and I like to have physical books to look at when, you know, thinking about things in certain places, if you know what I mean. Now this does say it's the complete step-by-step manual. It is not complete. There's millions of things to know, but this is a very nice book, especially if you're a beginner. This book will detail a bunch of different tools and things that you may or may not be aware of, and it tells you the overall use for those tools, both hand and power tools. It also has a useful layout guide for different shop layouts. It goes over safety. It also goes over various joinery methods. It goes over sanding methods, finishing methods, and different styles and species of woods that you can use, what they look like, what their hardness is, and a whole bunch of other nerdy information the woodworkers like. And the last section of the book includes plans and projects you can do in your shop. Pretty cool. It has tables, chairs, cabinets, all sorts of things, toolboxes, lots of really cool things in a very reasonably priced book. I'll drop a link to this one and a couple of more of my favorites I keep near the thermal. I'll show you 5 tips and tricks that every beginner woodworker needs to know. And if you've been woodworking long enough, you may know some of these, but I would venture to guess 1 or 2 of these you will not know. Nothing's more frustrating to a woodworker than having a stripped screw. You can't get that out because you've stripped the head or it was already stripped when you get the project in hand. Now this started out as a Phillips head screw and I've stripped it on purpose to show you how to remove it easily. When trying to back that screw out, if the head isn't all the way stripped, you can actually use a rubber band to get that out. Or you can use duct tape or any other sticky type tape. Or you can just use a vinyl glove. Anything that will help that bit grip the screw head, it'll back right out of there. Now, if it is totally stripped and nothing is working, not the duct tape, not the glove, not the rubber band, what do? You can use some locking pliers like this if the head is exposed to grip and grab that head, start turning it and it'll come right out of there. If the head is not exposed, one thing you can do is just take a flathead screwdriver. I recommend an old flathead screwdriver and a hammer and just basically knock a slot in there. If you have a rotary tool with a cutting head, you can do this much faster. This is a simple on-the-job site type application. Just use the flathead and knock a groove on each side, put a little pressure on there and back that screw right out. Next on the list, I'm gonna show you how to do a little measuring trick. So if I need to get a measurement inside this opening on my router table, for instance, or inside cabinets, between 2 walls, however you need a distance between 2 points that's kind of encased, and you can't just get outside to outside measurement, right? Some people try to use their tape measure. This one's 3 inches wide, some are 3.5. They're just different and adds more complexity than is necessary. You'll see people try to push on each end and then lock the tape and then try to read that measurement, and then where do you actually read it at? Where it's at, it's just confusing. You may also see people try to hold the tape on one end and bend it and then read the measurement that way. Well, that bend starts taking away from the measurement because it starts sloping up and it just distorts things. A much simpler way is to butt your tape up like you were going to, measure over any distance really. We're going to use 10 inches in this example because it's easy. Then we'll measure over from this side to the mark. Then you got 10 plus 4 is 14 and 7/8 of an inch. So now we know that the exact distance is 14 and 7/8. In woodworking, you're going to use that little measuring trick all the time in between 2 walls inside of a frame so you can get drawer sizes or door sizes to cut, cabinets, boxes, all types of stuff. That's just a really handy trick to have in your toolbox. When you're drilling holes, you may notice the bottom side of that hole will basically blow out. In other words, all the wood tears out around that hole and it looks like crap. It doesn't look good. How do you fix that? You can see here on one side, the first hole, I just drilled straight through and it just blew out the bottom of that hole. It's gonna look terrible if you're making a project. You can't have that. So if you just take and drill from one side until the tip of that drill bit starts coming through, you'll be able to feel it. Don't stick your finger under there while you're drilling, but stop every now and then and reach under there and feel. You'll start feeling where that tip is broke through. You'll flip it over and drill from the other side, perfectly clean holes every time. By drilling that hole from both sides, you eliminate the possibility of that blowout happening. And as a bonus tip, if you use a Forstner bit like this, you'll get those super clean, smooth holes on the inside, and they just drill a nicer hole versus a drill bit or a hole saw. I'll drop a link to a very affordable set of Forstner bits in the description below if you're interested. Let's talk about measuring and cutting parts. So if I wanted to cut this and I needed a 5-inch long piece out of this, I make that mark, I draw my line, and before I can actually take that piece over to the saw and cut it, I get distracted. I get a phone call, somebody texts me, then you start playing on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and 10 minutes later, you're like, oh yeah, I was cutting this part out. You come back, grab it, go cut it, and you cut the wrong side of the line. So what I got in the habit of doing is after I make my mark, I want to make sure we're cutting the right piece. This side's 5 inches. The piece that I'm not going to use, I just put an X on there. That way I know that I'm cutting on that side of the line. I've seen some people, when they make their mark, they'll draw a tick mark so that it shows this side of the line they're cutting off. However you need to indicate that, some squiggle, whatever you need to do. And then you bring it over to your saw and cut, right? So you want to cut that side of the line, line that up. I like to eyeball down that blade, make sure it's going to be right where I want it. So this piece is the drop piece. I don't need it. I'll throw it out of the way. This piece is the piece I want to keep, but as you can see, it's a little bit too long. I didn't quite get close enough to that line. A really good way is to sneak up on that. It's super easy. Check this out. What I'll do is bring the saw down. I'll push the piece into the blade, and that deflects the blade over just a little bit. And then while holding the piece, I'll let the blade back up. And then when you make your cut, it's actually going to just shave off a tiny bit off the piece you cut. You can see right there, I stopped it so I could show you exactly how much you were cutting off. It's like a 30-second. It's just a tiny amount. It's a great way to sneak up on your cuts. I actually use that little woodworking trick all the time to sneak up on angles, cuts, just to make everything fit just right. My number 5 tip that every beginner should know is it's okay to use pocket holes. I know a lot of times if you ask around on the internet, people say, they're terrible, they're gonna fail, they break, they're weak. That's malarkey. I've got tons of projects in my home. I've sold hundreds of things made out of pocket holes over the years, and I've never had one fail, not one. I've had a bunch of people compliment me on the projects. I've got plans available for most of the projects, and people have built tons of those. Pocket holes are extremely strong joint. A lot of people underestimate how good they really are. And what's really important about pocket holes is it's really easy for a beginner to get started making projects. And once you start making projects, your confidence builds and you want to make more and more and more, as well as your business grows and grows and grows because you keep generating sales for your business. I think pocket holes is one of the things that unlocked woodworking for me. Once I got a pocket hole jig, the world opened up to me. That's why I love them so much. Number 1 on the list is we're going to be using Plasti Dip for several purposes in the wood shop. Let me show you. If you have F-style clamps with these metal jaws, you know that these little plastic pieces that go on there, they come off really easy and you lose those, or while you're clamping, you can see it moving on you and it's just annoying. And most of the time though, you're gonna lose that. This Plasti Dip is what we're gonna use to coat the top of this. I'm also gonna coat a few other things to show you how useful it can be in the shop. Using the Plasti Dip, all I did was open it and stirred it up really good for probably about 60 seconds. And then you slowly dip your, whatever you're dipping, this in this case, the clamp in there. They say at a rate of about 5 seconds per inch. And then I left it submerged probably 15 or 20 seconds before removing it at the same rate. I also dipped several different pieces of a clamp in there to see if it would hold up or how well it would do on each piece. Then I also tried the hammer handle just to give it a little more grip because why not? I got it here, might as well use it. And then these pair of channel locks, I'm gonna dip these because they're missing their little covers. Stick around close to the end of the video. We're gonna check back in on that Plasti Dip. It has to dry or fully cure in 4 hours. Number 2 on the list, dry fitting dowels. Dowel joiners are a great way to add a next level to your woodworking if you've just been using pocket holes, because this hides the joint. It's a super strong joint, but when you go to dry fit things, a lot of times they get stuck because it's such a tight fitting joint. Before the glue, you have to really try to work those things back apart. A great way to prevent that is to take your couple of dowels into a piece of scrap, drill you a dowel hole, and then take it to the bandsaw and then cut some small slots in your dowels. These are for test only or test fitting, and then you can be able to put those together and they come apart much easier because you've cut a little bit of that dowel out and now it has some flex. So you can push those together and pull them apart much easier than if you were just using dowels that aren't cut. Then when you put them together, They're a lot more loose fitting like this. You'll still be able to make sure all your measurements are correct, make sure all your alignments are correct, but they come apart much easier. Now, before you glue them up, then you will take these out and use dowels that are not cut, and then you'll take these dowels and either keep them for later dry fits, or you can toss them because dowels are very cheap. And if you're interested in the Dowel Max itself, I'll put a link in the description. It's a really good dowel joinery system, super simple to use and extremely accurate. Number 3 on the list, getting glue on your clamps during a glue up is inevitable. It's going to happen. However, getting that glue off can be extremely frustrating, and it causes your clamps not to slide properly, and you got to keep them clean. So an easier way to keep those from sticking is to actually use paste wax. And while I was doing this, I thought, I wonder if the Teflon spray would work. So we're going to try that as well. If you have parallel clamps, you know when you're doing your glue ups that this glue drips down on the clamps themselves, and it prevents it from sliding very easily because that stuff gets caked on there, and it doesn't come off easy at all. There's a good way to prevent that from sticking. Good old-fashioned paste wax. Most of us have this in the shop anyway for your table saw tops or your planer beds. Did you know that you could actually treat your clamps, the bar of the clamps, with the paste wax? It'll prevent the glue from actually sticking to it. The one that's already got the glue dried on there, I'm not going to treat it, but I did treat this one. We'll put glue on both and see if it worked. I'm just going to slime the glue on these a little bit, and then we'll let them dry for 30 minutes or an hour, and I'll come back and tell you if it worked or not. Now, the only thing bad about this is it's going to create quite a bit of work for me back there to get that back off. I was curious if the dry lube would be better or about the same as the paste wax. Remember, this was no treatment. This is paste wax, and then now this is the dry lube one. I'm going to put some glue on there. We'll test all three and see what works and what don't. And if none of it works, I'm going to be in for a lot of cleaning here. All right, so this is the one with the dry lube. We're going to see if this comes off very easily. Oh yeah, it just peels right off with the finger. You can see it just pops right off. Of course, you can see the staining on the metal, but the actual glue's not stuck. It just basically peels right off of there. All right, now with the one with the paste wax on there. Oh yeah, look at that. Just as easy comes off. So that's actually, I was actually thinking the dry lube was going to work better. I really think the paste wax works better. This actually pops off a little bit easier than the dry lube. I think paste wax is the way to go there. Just run that jaw up and down a couple of times. It knocks all that glue off. You can see where it was. It's stained, but there's nothing there. Now for the one that wasn't treated with anything, yeah, it's not coming off. It doesn't peel off of there. It's stuck to the metal. Use paste wax, people. Number 4 on the list, we're going to use Teflon tape in the wood shop. This is actually used mostly in plumbing. However, it can be used in your wood shop for a few different purposes. Let me show you. Have you ever had any of this type finish in these metal cans and the lids get like legit stuck? You can't get them off because the finish when you pour it out dries on the lid. Like this is legit dried on there. You can see how that finish is just, it sticks and dries into the grooves of the cap when you get ready to tighten it back down. An easy way to prevent that is just simply use Teflon tape. Now you can buy this tape at any of your hardware stores. Just go with the threads. In other words, you're going to go clockwise. Get it on there pretty tight. Now when you put the cap back on, that's going to prevent that from sticking next time you get ready to use this in a month or two. Another use for the Teflon tape is if you have pipe clamps and you need to switch these out onto different size pipes, then of course just use this. Use it on your pipe clamps, that way it prevents that pipe from rusting to your clamp as these get older and you're taking them on and off and use them on different size pipes. You can also use Teflon tape on air compressor nozzles like this, on the threads where it inserts in there. That'll prevent that from leaking air. If you can apply this to all of your air compressor fittings, that means your air compressor won't leak and it won't be kicking on and off so much, annoying you all the time. Pretty much anything in the shop that has threads on it that you want to be able to take on and off easier or seal it up, Teflon tape's the way to go. Number 5 on the list, we're going to use kerf cuts to prevent squeeze out. There's several reasons why you may want to do this on a panel glue up, or if you're just gluing decorative pieces. Let me show you how it works. If you're gluing up say several pieces together, and especially for the top side of a project, you don't want to have to clean up a bunch of glue, or there's a reason why you don't want any glue up there at all. If you'll take one piece and cut a small kerf like this, about an 1/8 or 3/16 or a quarter down from the top, that's going to prevent that glue from squeezing out. We'll get one joint with no kerf, one joint with a kerf. And the key obviously is not to get any glue up here on this top piece above the kerf. As you can see, we got glue squeeze out on the top, on the side that has no kerf, and then of course one that does have the kerf, no squeeze out. That gives the glue a channel to go into. Now it's not going to affect your glue up because it's going to have plenty of glue on here to keep those boards tight. You'll have some glue squeeze out on the bottom obviously that you'll need to clean up, but on the top you're not going to have any at all, and it's going to be in that channel. It's not going to affect your project. And there's actually a more practical application to the kerf glue channel, more so than gluing up a panel. If you were, we'll pretend this panel's nice and flat, and we're going to glue this on there as a decorative piece. And when you do that, you don't want that glue to come out because it'll be in that corner. It's going to be really hard. So what I've done is actually put a little extra glue up next to the kerf just to test the kerf's ability to stop it. Now we're going to glue this on, so the kerf side's going to be on the top. We're going to glue this on, pretend this is a decorative piece, right? All right, we got glue squeeze out on the bottom, but on the kerf side, there's no glue squeeze out. You can see that it actually is pushed into the channel. That way it never comes out the top. So if you're putting on decorative pieces, you don't want that glue to come out. All you have to do is cut about an 1/8 inch, maybe less, of a kerf right there close to the top. That'll prevent any glue from coming out, and it'll keep you from having to worry about cleanup. Now you can actually put a kerf on the top and the bottom and just put the glue in the center. It'll never come out either side. So it's been about 5 hours since this one was put on, this dip, but it actually feels like it's stuck to the metal. You could probably take some other metal object and get it off. As far as durability goes, I mean, it's on there. And the purpose of it was so that we wouldn't have any marring or scuffing and scarring of the wood. I mean, it serves its purpose. This one I actually dipped the handle just to see if it give me a little extra grip versus the plastic on these. It's a little grippier, a little bit. This, it coated one of these. I had lost the plastic piece to that, so I was able to coat that, so that's good. And this, so now I've got this two that are coated. As far as the other items that I coated with the hammer, the handle, and the channel locks handles, this makes a night and day difference. I've had these channel locks since 1995, and the reason I remember that is when I went to work in construction, I bought these, and I've had them forever. So I lost the little plastic covers that come on there. You know, they slipped off or wore out or whatever happened to them. This is a really cool way to actually get my grip back on those, so I like that. As far as the handle goes on the hammer, it's actually really cool because it bonds to that wood and it gives it a nice grippy feel. I mean, I'm not really hammering on things with this. This is more of a tap in place type mallet, but I like that it has a little extra grip now. I just wanted to try it out. You don't have to get Plasti Dip in yellow. It comes in black and maybe some other colors. And I did put 3 coats of the Plasti Dip on the hammer and these channel locks. You wait about 15 minutes between coats. It's really easy. And I tried it on Bessie clamps, Harbor Freight clamps, and Jorgensen clamps, and it bonded to all of them equally as well. Today we're going to talk about the top 5 biggest mistakes that new woodworkers make. Stay tuned. How you doing? I'm Matt with 731woodworks.com. Today we're going to talk about all the mistakes to avoid as a new woodworker. Even if you're not a new woodworker, you can add value to this video by commenting below and let others know what your biggest mistake was when you first started woodworking. One of the first mistakes new woodworkers make, you think you got to have all the tools. Overspending on tools will hurt you in the short term because you're spending all of your proceeds and your profit from your builds on tools you don't need yet. So I started, as many of you know, with a couple of drills and a circular saw and was able to make some awesome projects. You don't need the latest and greatest tools to make woodworking projects. So get the basic tools you need. A lot of times you can buy those combo kits by Ryobi, DeWalt, Milwaukee, that kind of thing, and get most everything you're going to need for simple woodworking projects. As a beginner woodworker, you're going to be making beginner woodworking projects. Probably not going to jump straight into building some advanced stuff. So you don't need those advanced tools yet. So hold off on just going out and going gangbusters buying miter saws and table saws and drill presses, jointers and planers and all that stuff that you can eventually build up to and you'll eventually need if you're going to stay in woodworking, but you don't need those things up front. So I have a video all about what you need to get started woodworking. I'll drop a link in the description below. It's all about beginner woodworking tools. Basically, all you're going to need, some way to cut the wood, some way to put the wood together. That's really basically it if you just boil it down to the bare bone basic. If you have the money for a table saw, they are nice. They are awesome. I love my table saw. I use it all the time. But starting out, there's no way I could have dropped $600 on one and not been okay. I mean, that would have been taking food out of my family's mouth at that point. And so there was no way I was going to spend that kind of money on a tool that I could get around by using other tools until I was able to build up enough profits from the business to buy one. So overspending on tools, some good ideas to buy tools. Pawn shops, I heard a lot of people say they buy some tools at pawn shops. Look on the used market and see if you can find some used tools to save you a little bit of money starting out. It's a good way to do it. Second mistake I think a lot of new woodworkers make is you doubt yourself. Self-doubt kills your dreams, folks. You can't just constantly be so negative with yourself. Now, I'm not telling you to go out there and pick out the most advanced table you've ever seen with a bunch of ornate carvings and stuff like that. Of course not. Not starting out. I'm not going to pick something like that now. Be realistic with your projects, but don't doubt yourself. Have a little belief in yourself that you can actually do this stuff. It's made of wood. If it doesn't come out right, just burn it. I've taken on several projects that I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to turn out at the end. Some of them first-time builds for me as a commissioned project. I'm not saying you should do that, but I knew that I was going to be able to figure it out. And so by taking on those projects, I learned a whole bunch of skills. One, because it put myself in a position where I had to do it because my customer was depending on me to deliver the product. So now I know that I have to get it done. So it puts a little added pressure on me and makes me want to succeed in that area. So I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, so I do a lot of research, YouTube videos, that sort of thing, and then just start building the project. I have made several mistakes while I was building, and it cost me a little bit of money, but that's okay because I was able to learn something. I know that I can build that now, and it's in my portfolio of things that I'm able to offer customers. Remember, Miss 731 always says, if it's made of wood, it's not set in stone. If you mess up, invite the neighbors over. Y'all are having a marshmallow roast tonight. Stop doubting yourself that you can't do something because you haven't done it before. It's not an excuse. You're just telling yourself that so you don't have to get out there and do it. There's a ton of projects that I've built, like I said, that I had never done before. I'm not going to sit there and tell myself that I can't do it. I may have some doubts. I may have a few doubts saying, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know that I can figure it out, and so can you. The problem is there's a lot of people out there that have a whole lot of don't want to. That's not you because you're watching this video trying to learn what not to do, what mistakes not to make. So you have some want to. You're trying to learn as much as you can and make as few mistakes as you possibly can when you're starting out, and that's awesome. I like folks that's got some want to. Lazy has always gotten on my nerves, always. Believe in yourself and get out there and build it. If you mess up, don't be too hard on yourself. I see my mistake. You're gonna see your mistakes. When you see those mistakes and you build that project, don't start telling your customers, well, this is where I made the mistake. That takes me into the number 3 mistake beginners make. You see all your mistakes. You know everywhere you made a mistake on every project you've ever made. You can walk up to it and point it out to this day. Doesn't matter if you've been building for a week or for 2 years. The problem is when you start pointing out your mistakes to your customers, they don't know where they're at. They don't see that tiny little gap. They don't see where the measurement was off here or there. Don't tell them the problems with your projects. If it's a glaring error and you know you've made a bad mistake, you probably need to start the project over or figure out a way to fix it. But those minor mistakes and those minor errors in there, the customer doesn't need to know those. That's character. They don't care about your little tiny mistakes. They don't care about that little gap. They don't care about it being off a quarter of an inch here or there if it comes out like it's supposed to. What happens when you start showing the imperfections in your finish, the imperfections in your paint, the imperfections in the measurements or whatever it was that you messed up on, what you're doing is showing your customer all your mistakes and telling them you're not competent enough to order from again. I'm not telling you to be dishonest. I'm telling you that the tiny minor mistakes you see may not be that to another person. So don't just point out every single mistake you made when they come to pick up their order, or if you're delivering it, when you deliver it, don't just start showing everything where you think you did wrong. It's okay if a custom built piece of furniture is not exactly perfect. That's what makes it custom built. It's not supposed to be perfect. We are imperfect beings. We're not ever going to make perfect things. It just can't happen. Another mistake that beginner woodworkers make is either underpricing or overpricing their project. Now I have a pricing video and I have a video on every project I've made on what I priced it at. You can check those out. They'll be linked in the description below. Main thing you want to do is do a little bit of research. If your project materials cost $100, don't sell it for $125. You're not doing anybody any favors. You're hurting your business. You're hurting all the other woodworkers in your area. What happens is you're undercutting everybody. So you're selling this project that's for $125 where everybody else is selling it for $225. Yeah, you're getting some orders, but what's going to happen is you can't sustain that. So what do you think happens? You're working your tail off for $25 of profit when you're spending hours building these projects. Well, then now that you've got a few customers wanting this, you start getting a bunch of orders at that price, and you're working your rear end off trying to keep up with those orders at such a low price that you're not making any money, you're wasting your time. So you stop doing it. What you've done is you've hurt all the other woodworkers in your area. You guys are not competition, you guys are friends. We're all in this together. There's no reason to undercut everybody. I'm not telling you can't undersell them a little bit, $20 here or there. There's other ways of making that up. They can use higher quality materials, higher quality paints. They already have an established customer base. But if you're out there undercutting everybody's price on purpose, it's not gonna last. You're not gonna stick in the game very long, and you're not gonna make any money doing it anyway. The name of the game, if you're in business to make money, you want to make a decent profit at a fair price. On the other end of that spectrum is if you're overpricing things. For instance, if this is all I have handy, white oak mallet I made a couple of years ago. If I try to sell this thing for $300, you know what's gonna happen? I'm not gonna sell it. Nobody's gonna buy this wood hammer for $300. Mike could get 50 to 75 for it, maybe. If a woodworker needs one and don't wanna make one themselves. If you build an end table out of spruce or pine and you try to sell it for $500, it's probably not gonna happen. So just be mindful of the materials you're using, your skill level, and then what you're pricing it at. You wanna find a good, happy medium on your pricing. I believe that my pricing video will help you with that. I'll drop a link in the description below to how to price your woodwork. I think another mistake we make as beginner woodworkers is trying to do it alone. I've had huge support from my wife. She's been absolutely amazing. She has helped me sand projects. She's helped paint projects. She has been absolutely amazing. I can't ever thank her enough for the amount of support and work she's put in to this business. You may not have that support, but you're not alone. You can follow me on Instagram at 731 Woodworks. The whole woodworking community on Instagram is there to support each other. I've gotten a lot of advice about Etsy, about selling, about pricing, about building projects, all from woodworkers on Instagram. We're there to help you. So be sure that you're connected in some type of woodworking community, whether that be Instagram or any other social media. It's a good tool to have on your side. Ecclesiastes 4:12 says, a person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two stand back to back and conquer. Three are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken. Who's watching out for you? If you team up with somebody, or if you've got huge support in your life, if you're asking for help and advice, it's gonna make your business stronger. It's gonna help you starting out woodworking and make it a whole lot a smoother transition than some of us have taken on. Main thing is, as a beginner woodworker, you're gonna make mistakes. We all do. Main thing is to stay safe. Make sure you adhere to the safety warnings of your tools. They will hurt you. They will hurt you bad. Always respect that tool. Doesn't matter if you're using circular saws, table saws, hand saws, drills. No matter what you're using, you be safe. Make sure you respect the fact that that tool can hurt you, and it can hurt you bad. If you make other mistakes that don't injure you, that's okay. That's how we learn. We learn from our mistakes. Most of us do anyway. I've learned a lot from my mistakes. And so as long as you're learning from those mistakes, you're gonna make progress. And making progress is what you're after. If you're trying to build a business, and you're trying to sustain a business in woodworking, if you're just starting out, make sure you take the advice of others, seek out the advice of others. Don't overprice your projects. Don't buy a bunch of tools you don't really need. Believe in yourself. That's gonna be the main one. Don't point out your mistakes to your customers. Care. If you believe in yourself, you believe you can make a go at it, you'll take yourself a very, very long way. If you doubt yourself and you're constantly talking negative to yourself, that negative talk's gonna get in there and it's gonna get down in your soul. And then you ain't gonna be able to do it because you already doubt yourself. You've already planted that seed that says you can't. I say you can. That's what I'm doing. I'm planting that seed that says you can do it. Get out there, get off your tail, quit doubting yourself, go out there and make some sawdust. That's the only way you're gonna get better is you start making sawdust. Stay in your house and you sit there and think about how many projects you can't build with the tools you got. Of course you can't build them because that's what you've told yourself. If you get out there and tell yourself you can do it and you say, I can do it, I've only got a drill and the saw. I'm gonna go look up projects that only take a drill and the saw to make. And then I'm gonna sell those, and I'm gonna take the profits and buy a table saw. Or I'm gonna take those profits and buy a miter saw. I'm gonna take those profits and buy whatever you need next to build the projects you're wanting to build. That's how you build the business. Believe. You gotta believe in yourself. Going to the store and picking out some sweet looking lumber, bringing it home and having it warp or twist after you get it home, or even worse, after you've built your project, you come out the next day and it's twisted or warped and all bent out of shape. Make you sick. Let me tell you how to avoid some of that. One of the most difficult things for an intermediate or beginner woodworker to figure out is how do you prevent wood from warping? This video is brought to you by 731woodworks.com. Go check out our online store. We have easy to follow build plans to help you make awesome projects. Take advantage of some of our bundles. That's helped you save the most money possible because those are already discounted. And if you use the code WARPED, you'll get 20% off any order. First and foremost, it all begins when you select your lumber at the store. It doesn't matter if you're going to Home Depot, Lowe's, or your local lumber yard. My local lumber yard actually stores the lumber outside. So it's in a covered area, but it's still outside. I think Home Depot and Lowe's has a little bit of an advantage, although as fast as that stock's overturning, I don't think it matters a lot. The moisture content of construction grade lumber usually is upwards of 15 to 19%, so it's actually a fairly high moisture content in the lumber. And what that means is when you get it home, it's going to start drying out, and when it starts drying out, it's going to do what wood does, and that's move. A couple of things to note where the wood's going to move at. If you pick out a board that looks like that, basically a bullseye, that's called the pit, or the center of the tree. You'll either notice it right there where you see the bullseye look, or another telltale sign is you'll see a dark stripe down it. Another place your construction grade lumber is going to move is around big knots. I like big knots and I cannot lie, but it's going to move right there every time. See that big knot? It looks cool. It's going to give it some nice figure, nice look, especially if you're building like a farmhouse tabletop that's going to stain. Those knots look really good, but you have to understand that there will be a twist or a move right there because that wood grain is so tight around that knot. Case in point, check this 8-foot 2x6 out. This thing is like a rocking horse. It is twisted, it is bowed, it is moved every which way a 2x6 can move. If you eyeball down this 2x6, about 3/4 of the way down, you'll notice where it's actually bent. That's where it moved. Why did it move right there? There's a really gnarly knot right there. It's where it's going to twist at because you see how all that wood grain is moving in different directions. When that stuff starts drying out, it's going to move there. You can pick up a moisture meter, fairly inexpensive, $20, $25. I'll drop a link in the description below to one I recommend, but construction grade lumber is going to be high in moisture content anyway. You're going to bring that home. Ideally, you would let that set 2 or 3, 4 weeks in your garage or shop to acclimate. None of us do that because we're in a hurry and we're building projects as we get the funds or as we get deposits. That's how I always did it. So I didn't really have time to let it sit. So what do? Me personally, I come up with this strategy on stacking lumber that actually worked. I stacked it not on the concrete floor. I actually put scraps down, stacked my lumber on top of those scraps so that it's not touching the floor. Concrete naturally has moisture in it, so if you lay your lumber on the floor, it's going to soak up into the lumber. Then what I did was take some concrete blocks, haydite blocks, whatever you want to call them, stack them on top of my lumber stack. That keeps the wood from moving because it's weighted. I did this for a long, long time and it worked very, very well. I made sure to weight each end if possible and in the middle if on longer pieces. This is my lumber storage. Got my 2x4s, 2x6s, some 1x stacked on there. Those bricks really help. Keeps the weight on there and keeps them from twisting and bowing until I can get to them. Works nicely. And then I got a big pile of crap back there I need to clean up. On shorter pieces, I got away with just stacking one block on top of all of them. Kind of seems silly in that it won't work, but it actually does work. It just prevents it from curling up on you before you can get to it. Another thing I found helpful was basically using my workbench as a caul. So cauls actually clamp onto a tabletop or a cutting board, whatever you're gluing up, and it keeps that wood from curling or moving on you while the glue dries. I used this for a long time. I would just clamp my work pieces or my tabletops to the workbench while the glue was drying. That prevented that thing from moving or cupping on me. And the reason I started doing that was a couple of tabletops I would make, I would go in for the night, come back out the next morning, and it would be smiling at me on the workbench because it was so bad warped. Now after it was clamped, I tried to stain and finish it within a day or so and then get that attached to the base as quickly as possible. I always use tabletop fasteners. I have a whole video on how to attach a tabletop to a base. I'll link it at the end of this video or in the description. One thing you can do is actually try to pick out wider stock. So if you're needing a 2x4, maybe pick out a 2x6 or a 2x8 that you can actually rip down to the size you need. So if you do have a knot to work around, you can actually rip that piece out of a wider piece. Most of us that use construction grade lumber to build furniture know that most people prefer it stained instead of the natural color, and that's a good thing because actually staining prevents that wood from warping as fast because it actually goes in and soaks into the wood pores and the fibers and keeps that moisture content level as we can. And then if you put another finish on top of it, like polyurethane, that it seals it even more. Another thing you can do is, even if you don't have a mini split or something to control the temperature, is pick up a dehumidifier. I'll drop 2 options below. One's actually really small, but it works fairly well for a decent sized area. And then the other one is actually made for a bigger area like a garage. It's a little more expensive. If you're able to control the moisture content in your area, such as with the dehumidifier, I highly recommend you picking one up. It's made quite a bit of difference in my shop. I actually bought the dehumidifier way before I bought the mini split to control the temperature. The dehumidifier made a big difference, so much so that I actually didn't have to weight down my lumber anymore. I just was able to stick it on the shelf because the moisture content remains the same in this room, and I made sure to keep that garage door closed as much as possible. As far as plywood goes, when you pick that out at the lumber store, ensure that it is flat and not twisted or warped, because really there's no way to work with warped plywood. If it's a little bit bowed or warped, you can deal with that if you're making something that you're going to rip this stuff down into sheets, or if you're attaching it to something, because it will give a little bit. As far as storing plywood, I like to stack it vertically like that. Seems to work really well. As long as you can get it fairly vertical, you'll need to leave it leaning a little bit so that it can actually lay against the wall and not fall out. If you do wind up with a piece of lumber that is really warped or twisted or bent or just trash, you can actually break it down into smaller pieces and use those for different things. So if you can cut a piece that's about 2 foot long, maybe 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, that'll actually save it so that you can use it for something else. Another common question I get on after the tabletop is together and it's warped, if you've ensured that it was flat when you put it together, the moisture content was low, but it's still warped, and you see it warping as you're putting it together, especially with pocket hole screws. The main cause of that is actually your edges aren't exactly 90 degrees to each other. So when you tighten down those pocket hole screws, it pulls it to flat where both pieces are actually flat against each other, and that's actually pulling it out. Even if you got, say, 6 pieces and it's barely moving on each one, by the time you get to the last one, it'll be cupped on you, the whole tabletop. So ensure that you're cutting 90 degrees, so check your blades, make sure everything's set up properly. The drier you can get the wood, the better. However, it's not impossible to work with wood that is over 10 or 12% in moisture content. I built tons of stuff, and yeah, I had some issues early on, but once I figured out kind of what was going on, you can actually work around those issues and make some awesome pieces that just last a very long time. I have many in our house that are made with construction grade lumber. Never had any issues. Possibly one of the most dangerous things in your shop actually came as a safety device with your table saw. One thing you never think about hurting you is the safety device that's supposed to keep you from getting hurt. However, these plastic ones aren't the best thing to keep you safe, because if they make contact with the blade, they can literally explode into dozens of sharp flying plastic pieces that can injure you, such as the case as you see here. I was on Facebook the other day and saw on the SawStop users group, Mr. Tony Allen had exactly this happen to him. And this was right after I was thinking about making this video, so it just drove home the point that these are actually very dangerous. I reached out to Tony on Facebook and asked him if I could use these pictures, and he graciously agreed. This caused a major injury to his arm because the saw blade contacted this push stick, and that caused the push stick to basically come into pieces, and one flew and hit him in the forearm, creating a very nasty gash. We'll blur it out just so that you don't have to see the gory picture. Thankfully, Tony wasn't hurt any further, but man, these shockingly aren't that great. But there is a better option. I'm going to first tell you about a better alternative, but stick around. We're going to run these through blades and see if we can basically replicate that explosion that's happening, and I'm going to set up a safety barrier so I don't get injured with this stuff. Let's do it. This is the bow push stick that has an EVA foam insert that's replaceable if it gets cut, and it's a very durable foam. You can see here that it doesn't compress much, but it gives you enough that it grips the wood when you push it through. And most importantly, if that hits the blade, literally nothing happens other than the foam gets cut. And because these are reversible, you get 2 uses out of 1, but they're very, very inexpensive to replace, like $5 or $6 per 2-pack. And speaking of inexpensive, these are only about 20-ish bucks, so really cheap to save anything from exploding in your hand. Now, full disclosure, Bo did send me this specific one, but I liked it so much I went ahead and purchased another one to have in the shop. Because after seeing the thread on the saw stop where Tony Allen posted, there were several other people that had very similar incidents with these, and I'm replacing all of these with some of these. If you're interested in picking up one or more of these push sticks, I'll put a link in the description below to them. And I can save you 10% on any of these if you use the code 731BO10, give you 10% off your order. So what I've done is set up a high fence, and I have this jig that I've got this push stick connected to, so I can run that into the blade from behind this barrier. But I've also got this sheet of 3/4 inch plywood that I'm gonna set here and get behind, and then I can push the stick from this side, and hopefully that should protect me, right? Let's find out. Woo! Felt it kick a couple times. What we got? I've definitely messed up my zero clearance. Try it again. Whoa! Oh. I heard it hit back here, but I don't know where it's at. Definitely a big piece missing. Try again. Stuck on something. It hung down in the zero clearance. I think this push stick is done. This makes me very, 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 very uncomfortable. Because I don't know where all these pieces are going. I certainly don't want to mess the saw up, but I kind of want to see what happens. So I jumped. It's stuck again. Last time with this push stick. All right, so now I'm going to simulate actually pushing a piece of wood through the blade while also using a push stick from behind here. I've switched out the push stick, so we got a different brand, different model, different type of plastic. We'll see how it reacts. I really think the harder, the more brittle plastic, the worse off you're going to be. This one seems to be a little softer. We'll see what happens. So if this kicks back, I don't want to blow a hole through my garage door. So security. I kind of expected that one to do that because it's such a soft plastic. This one you could even feel how much softer it is. And only the back, the cleat got hung up in the blade. So we'll see what happens if the whole thing touches the blade. We'll put a slight angle on the blade and see if that does anything else. We're at about 8 degrees, let's go to 10. Not much, a little anticlimactic, but that's all right. This plastic is much, much softer than this plastic. This, you can tell this is you just tell the sound difference. You can feel it too. I really think this one at a degree would probably not do well. All right, the really hard push stick with a 10-degree angle on the blade. I felt it pop. Yep, it popped down in the zero clearance and broke that. All right, so this time I'm going to attempt to stay behind my shield. But I feel like this is more of an angle that would be appropriate for a push stick, and this is the last plastic one I have to destroy. So we'll see how this works. I'm just gonna, again, be back here on this side and push it into the blade and see what happens. Hopefully nothing terrible, but I'm gonna stay way back here. Ready? Whoa. Well, that one come apart. Several pieces flew out of there, some really sharp, small pieces, but it come undone from a push stick. I may reattach that and see what happened, but I gotta find all those screws first. Take two. Woo! While it didn't kick back, it is lodged in that throat plate now, and I'm gonna have to pull it out of there. And you can see that it has completely destroyed my zero clearance insert, and that's my cost, my gift to you, I guess, because now I've got to purchase a new one of those. Probably not the smartest idea, but the only way to test that was to actually run it into the blade and see what happened. And so now you can see that while some pieces and shards are gone, I don't know where they're at, they flew away. This push stick is destroyed, the tip is completely gone, and so is my insert. A lot of people use wood push sticks, but most of those get your hand pretty close to the blade. I like this because you are still away from the blade, and there's a couple of other features that this has that a lot of the other push sticks can't offer. This EVA foam is very, very strong. I even tried to stand on it to see how much it compresses. It doesn't compress much at all, which means it's really good stiff foam, but it's not so stiff and hard that it's gonna damage your wood or your projects. And because it's EVA foam, it's not gonna mar your wood like a hard plastic would. Wood. And because this is a high density foam, it actually absorbs vibration, so that chatter you sometimes get when you push the wood through, it helps absorb that. And the handle is actually a really good designed handle as far as ergonomics goes. It gives you a lot of good control. I really like this. Yes, they did send me this, but yes, I did go ahead and order myself another one because I liked it so much. While I didn't get a violent explosion was what I was kind of hoping to catch on camera. You can see that Tony Allen actually had that happen, which caused that injury. So it's proven that these things are wildly unpredictable as to what's going to happen when they hit the blade. Now I had several pieces fly off that if they hit me maybe or maybe not, they injure me, but it obviously damaged the table saw throat plate and of course destroyed the push stick. So they're just unpredictable, which is why I really don't recommend them. And as you see with the plastic versus the bow push stick, once the plastic hits the blade, they're done. They're going to be destroyed or damaged to the point you can't use them. Where the bow, once it hits the blade, it's just going to cut it. You can still use it or just flip that around and start all over. But I'm going to keep a 2-pack of these replacements in there just in case, because I don't want to ever be without my push stick. As you can see from my videos, from Bo's videos, when these things hit the blade, bad things happen. Now, that's not a normal circumstance, but stuff happens. This push stick is actually not meant to be a sacrificial push stick. In other words, you're not supposed to be just using it, running it through the blade. But again, things happen, and if it does happen, you can see what happens when the foam hits the blade. Literally nothing. I was confident enough to stand behind the saw and use it like normal with the blade going through the foam. Zero things happen other than the foam getting cut. There's no pushback, there's no vibration, there's nothing that's going to cause this to catch or anything like that. It just slices through there. Conversely though, when you put this plastic push stick in there, several different things happen. One, you have a bunch of tiny shards of plastic flying all over the place. Some hit the garage door with pretty good violence, and this was popping and everything else. It actually broke my zero clearance insert. In other words, a piece hard enough went through that zero clearance insert. And it's just all around more dangerous to use the plastic ones versus the foam. If I needed a sacrificial push stick, I would just make one out of wood. But if I want an everyday push stick that's good control, that's really nice, this is the one I'm gonna be picking up. Just based on that Facebook thread alone, there were multiple people that got injured just using plastic push sticks. That's enough, in my opinion, to make me make the decision to switch to something like this. And it's up to you to decide which ones you're gonna use. I've got 25 plus ways to use one of the most unique and versatile tools you'll ever put in your workshop. Let me show you. These are 1, 2, 3 setup blocks, and they come in a variety of version. You got a no-hole version, a 1-hole, an 11, and a 23-hole version. Primarily today, we'll be talking about the 23-hole version. If you're interested in picking up a set of 1, 2, 3 blocks or the connection kits, there'll be links in the description below if you can go check them out for yourself. When you first get your 1, 2, 3 blocks in the shop, you're gonna wanna unbox them, unwrap this paper that's on them. There's gonna be a thin coat of oil on there to keep them from rusting. While in transport, you wanna wipe that off, wipe it clean, take some paste wax and put on there, and that's gonna stop them from rusting if you're in a high humidity area. Now, these amazing little tools were never meant to be used in a wood shop. They're actually made for machine shops, metal workers, not us woodworkers. But they have so many uses in the workshop that woodworkers have to have them. These are made from hardened steel, so you can drop them, you can drop kick them. I wouldn't, but you can. If you do, it's gonna hurt. These can't be damaged for the most part. In the wood shop, you're never gonna damage them. So they're gonna last forever. These are exactly 1 inch by 2 inch by 3 inch, and they're always made in pairs. So you're gonna get a matching pair every time. And they're within 1/10,000th of an inch accurate on that 1, 2, 3. How small is 1/10,000th? Well, if you split a human hair, those of you who have hair, if you split a human hair 30 times, one of those 30th strands will be 1/10,000th of an inch. You'll never need anything more accurate in your shop, I guarantee it. The sides are also perfectly parallel within 2/10,000ths of an inch, still extremely small, and they're square to 3/10,000ths of an inch, also more than you'll ever need. Let me show you everything these amazing tools can do in your wood shop. And if I miss some, comment below what you use them for. Since these are so precisely square, they're obviously good for using as a small square. You can square up your table saw blade, your table saw fence, you can check your miter saw blade, you can check your jointer fence, or even inside small boxes or drawers to check and see if those are square. Obviously, you can use them to set 1 inch by 2 inch or 3 inch blade heights. If you need more precision, check out these brass setup blocks that have markings on them. Now I've got 1.5, 1 3/8, or you can combine them for like 1 5/8, whatever you need. You can also use them at the router table to set the bit height so you can cut dados and grooves exactly where you want them. You can also set your fence an exact distance away from the blade at 1 inch, 2, 3, by combining them 4, 5, and 6 inches away. Pair the 1, 2, 3 blocks with these awesome little corner clamps, and now you've got a corner clamping jig. You can use it to clamp up panels or even small boxes and parts while you let the glue dry, make your joinery, anything like that. And because these are perfectly square, your box or your project's going to be square when you clamp these down tight. Or you can simply use these as a paperweight. You know, if you got your shop fan going, or if you're just cleaning up, then a lot of times you blow your papers off. You can use it as a small cutting guide. You can also use these as drill bit guides, so you make sure you drill that hole straight up and down every time. Also, because these holes are exactly spaced, if you needed to space them out in any orientation there, you could use that for spacing as well. If you're using smaller bits, you can use that hole as a guide so that you can ensure that you're not tilting one way or the other. You can also simply just use the edge of the block to ensure that you're straight up and down. Also, if you needed to tap some threads in a hole, this is a good way to do that too, because you're going to be able to hold that straight up and down while you tap. Because these are so precise, anytime you get a new square in the shop, be sure and use one of these to check and ensure all of your squares are square. And because we know these are within 1/10,000th of an inch, 3 inches by 1 inch by 2 inch, you can check your tape measures to ensure that they are also accurate. These actually make a really cool pencil holder for your workbench, so you can always find a pencil and then you can always put it back when you're done, and that'll help you find it next time. Also, driver bit organizers, this is perfect for that. And if you team them up with some of these rare earth magnets that fit almost perfectly in those holes, you can take these around on the workbench and not worry about them falling out. It's super cool. Or you can leave them in your toolbox without the magnets and You'll have your driver bits there. Also for cutting small dowels, things like that, these are great just to help guide your saw to keep everything nice and square. If you have some rare earth magnets, they stick right to this block, and if you have a metal rule, then you can stick that to the block, line everything up, and now you have a height gauge for your router table, for your table saw, or to set the fence a specific distance. This is a great way to get just a nice little setup gauge, super easy. Pair one of these solid blocks with a digital depth gauge like this and a mag base, and you can check the thickness of stock, like this piece of walnut. And you know exactly how thick it is for the CNC, or if you're doing precise mortise and tenon, this will give you the exact measurement. You can use the same depth gauge setup to check for coplanar on your jointer beds, and you can also set precise heights of your router bits with this. And you can even check the distance of the fence, so you get those set up just perfectly right. Another fantastic use for these 1, 2, 3 blocks is just using them as a stop block on your table saw. If you want to make short pieces, then when you set this on the fence, what you're getting is 1 inch away. So now you can use your cursor, just add an inch. So if I needed to cut 2-inch pieces, I move the cursor down to 3 inches, set it, and when I make this cut, that's going to be a 2-inch piece every single time. So I cut it, then I move it, I cut it, I move it, and then I've got 2-inch pieces every time. Now you never want to cut like this without a stop block, a 2-inch piece. That'll get jammed in there and between your blade and the fence, and it'll cause a kickback. So you want to actually use one of these stop blocks. The good thing about these are they are fairly heavy, so you're not going to move, but they will a little bit, and we have a solution for that. Check this out. So Mike Taylor came up with this jig, and it's very simple. I've named it the Oklahoma jig because it's shaped like Oklahoma, right? So what we're going to do is, this is just a 5/16 bolt that he stuck glued in there and drilled 7/16 to the center. What that does is it's going to allow, when it sets on that, it's genius, when it sets down on that block, you're going to have a little bit of that block protruding about 1/16 of an inch. And the reason for that is you can have these fence clamps similar to these, or even a dovetail clamp, something like that will fit down in that hole. The way it leverages the inside of that pin is pulling the block toward the fence and pushing it down, so it's not going to move. And it's still perfectly square with the fence and 1 inch. So now this isn't going to move. It's going to be there while we make our cuts. So it doesn't matter how many 2-inch blocks or 3-inch blocks or how many blocks you need to make. We've got all those cut. It's going to be the exact same every time. That block's not going to move on you. It's just an awesome use. This is an Oklahoma jig, y'all. Super simple. So if you want to make one of these for yourself, the Oklahoma jig, this piece of the block's 3 inches, this is 3 inches, and then it's about 3 inches tall. So if you cut your block out 6 by 3 and then cut this 3-inch notch out. This hole here is about 1 3/4 or 1.5 inches from the end, and this is 7/16 in from the edge, and then also about 1.5 inches from the end. So it's a very simple jig you can make for this 1, 2, 3 block. Now Mike developed and come up with this kit on his own to join 2 of these blocks together. It includes all the screws, everything you're going to need to join them in any orientation that you could possibly conceive of and use for jigs and other things. I'm fixing to show you a bunch of ways to use them. You have 4 of these nuts that have threads inside, and then you have all of these bolts at different lengths to join them in different orientations. Obviously the shorter bolts will join the 2 1-inch or the 2 sides together. The medium length are going to be for medium hookups, and then the longer for the long hookups. 2 of these have threads and 2 do not. 2 is going to allow that to pass through, and what that's going to do is give you a stop inside for the head of the bolt. Now that we have these joined at this 90-degree block, we've got 4 inches this way, we've got 3 inches this way, and it's perfectly square. And the reason is, when you tighten these bolts down, this side's flat, so we know that this is going to be perfectly square. Just set it on a table saw, something like that, something really flat. But when you tighten it up, that'll ensure everything lines up perfectly. Now we can actually use this orientation for a few different things. Check this out. You can use this as a shoulder square, so you can mark 2 lines on 90-degree sides of the board, so you can carry that line all the way across. This is also great if you have taller pieces that you set up just to hold them in place while you get the other pieces joined up or get them lined up. And of course you can use the corner squares again with this, and you'll have more surface area, giving you a more accurate 90 degree. You can also use this at the drill press to drill 90 degrees down into the edge or the end of a board, especially if you don't have a fence or any other way to clamp your pieces down. Earlier we used the block for a drill guide, but if you have a drill bit that will not fit through those holes, this is an excellent drill guide. You got a 90-degree corner, you just hold it straight up and down and drill a straight hole. This works great. Now I've got the 1-inch sides together here, and this gives me a little bit more surface area as far as using it as a square. inside square or even a little outside square if you want it. You'll notice this kit, everything is embedded inside the blocks. Before, most people would connect these with bolts and nuts and they would be popping out of the sides, and then you couldn't use those as squares, things like that. But with Mike Taylor's hardware kit, you certainly can use these as squares and straight edges and things. Now, one thing to note when you put these together, you'll notice that there is a flathead slot right there. He actually sends this flathead bit with it, so you can put that in there just like that and hold that while you put the bolt through. But the line indicates which way the bolt is going and which way to orient that nut inside, so you know where the hole is without having to feel around and look for it. With the hardware kit, you can join two together just like this, and now you've got a 6-inch perfect straight edge. You can use that on your jointer to set up your jointer beds, or just use it as a straight edge or anything you need in the shop. Another use for the blocks, or you can use one as a backer if you're gluing up like a 90 here. Use one as a backer to hold pressure. The other one here, that's going to give you a perfect 90 degree when you sandwich the one piece in between the two. Good way to hold pressure while you make that glue up. You can also use these 1, 2, 3 blocks as stop blocks. All you need is a 5/16 inch bolt, like this T-bolt, slide into the T-track. Then if you use these connected like this, all you have to do is put a knob on top, tighten it down, you've got a T-track stop block. But if you don't want to use T-track, I've got another method that Mike showed me from MateiTools.com that we can build our own little jig to make these a no deflection stop block, and it's going to clamp down super tight with no T-tracks. Let me show you. You're going to need a piece of hardwood of some kind. I'm going to use walnut, but you can use maple or whatever you got on hand. First thing I did was go to the table saw and set the fence 2 inches away from the blade using the stop block. That way I know I get exact, precise piece. And then I ripped this piece of walnut 2 inches wide. Next thing I did was take the stop block and lay it on top, use drill bits to center the drill so I know exactly where I need to drill those 3 holes. And then 2 of those holes on the outer edges are going to be stopped. In other words, we're not drilling all the way through, but that center hole we are drilling through. So I just use a piece of painter's tape here so that I could drill down where I know where to stop. Once those 3 holes were set, then you could take it over and cut it. I cut a 1-inch piece first, but then I kind of decided I wanted a 2-inch piece, so I went back later and cut a 2-inch piece. I used my multi-tool here with a multi-purpose blade and was just cut the heads of those bolts off. For the holes in this stop block, I used a bit that was barely less than 5/16 of an inch. That way when I take these bolts, I can thread them in the hole and they'll hold a little better. Or you could drill it a little bit bigger and then just drop those in and epoxy or CA glue them in. But I did use a little CA glue to help hold them in also. And then for the center bolt, you're going to need a 5/16 inch carriage head bolt, about 3.5, 4 inches long, depending on how thick your fence is. Once you have all those bolts set, then you'll be able to put these 2 pieces together, take it over to your crosscut sled if you've got 2 pieces of plywood for your fence, in other words, 1.5 inches thick. This is going to work for that, or any thinner than that, or just a single piece. But you don't need T-track, and that's one of the great things about this little stop block. No T-track needed. Just a super awesome stop block, quickly adjust, and it is super solid. Not going to move on you when you clamp that thing down. If you don't have 1, 2, 3 blocks yet, pick you up a pair. You will not regret it. They're very inexpensive for what you're getting. The most accurate, most versatile tool you could possibly get in your wood shop. Pick up some of these corner clamps while you're there. Also a connection kit. There's no end to the things that you can do with these things. I'm telling you, you're gonna love them. Check the link in the description below to get your set. So what I was doing was I'm making a video on how to create these charcuterie boards using templates. And these are just acrylic or plexiglass that you can buy locally. Cut them in any shape you want. This one is a well board sent to me by Red Woodworks. Thanks, sir. This one was sent to me by Crafted Elements, and this is just basically a smaller version, but in a different shape. You just use CA glue and some tape and tape these to the boards, and then you just run them around a flush trim bit. That's where the trouble started. I got my laptop so that I can play back the footage and talk about it. What's fascinating, I had 6 kickbacks using the router bit, and I was using it improperly, and it was completely my fault. It wasn't until I started playing the footage back that I realized that I almost messed up big time. So first off, when I got the bit out of the package, this thing is massive. It's a Whiteside Ultimate Flush Trim bit. So even here, I say that I was nervous. I'm pretty nervous. That's a big bit. Let's see what happens. So as you can see, when I opened, I already was setting myself up for failure because I was intimidated by the tool. And I think that's one of the reasons why I had issues. Now installing the bit was just like installing any other bit. It was pretty simple to do. You just put it in your router table and go. Now I will admit, I've not used the router table much at all. I typically use a hand router, and the only time I use a router table is when I'm doing roundovers or just flushing up some stuff, some very little stuff. Like I've used it very little. So I glued the template onto the board using CA glue and painter's tape. Super easy to do, and I even cut off some excess so that I wouldn't have too much for the flush trim bit to do. So the first kickback I had, the problem is I tried to start like a quarter way in, and you could even see me jerk my arm back. I was setting myself up for failure there. Kickback number 2 was just right after that. What did I do? I moved the board on the wrong side of the bit, and instantly, as soon as it touches the bit, what happens? I totally lost control of it. It flew all the way off the table and onto the ground. My hand was pulled toward the bit. Now that could have been extremely bad, because if that bit hits these fingers, they're mauled. Kickback number 3, the exact same thing, except this time I'm nervous, and you can see it when I barely touched the bit. And had I started at that point, it probably would have been okay. But I moved the board just a little bit where there was a little more meat left sticking out. Why did I do that? I have no idea, other than I was just not thinking. Kickback number 4, the exact same thing, 3 times in a row. I have no excuse other than I was just being a dummy. I wasn't thinking, I thought I could do it. I never stopped to think, hey, you should ease into this from the right side. I want to show you that between number 4 and 5, what actually happened was, I'll play the clip right here. You can see the end of kickback number 4. I say, gosh dog, I go around and pick the board up and do it again. I actually hesitated several times and was just trying to ease into the bit. And then of course, when it grabs it, it's gonna throw it every single time, because the number one problem I was having was I was trying to start in the middle instead of on the end and work my way correctly, which would be from the right to the left into the cut of the bit. And finally, kickback number 6, you can see that I kind of eased into it and did pretty good going in as far as it not kicking back. I still wish I had this done over, but I went all the way around the handle and it done just perfectly fine, because once the cut starts, I can keep pressure against the bearing and it works just like it's supposed to. The problem comes when I basically try to go in at the wrong, for one, it's on the wrong side, and I'm pushing straight into the bit, which is a huge no-no. Now those 6 kickbacks happened in a matter of 4 or 5 minutes apart from each other. Like, it was just back-to-back errors. And that is usually when massive injuries happen, especially when you just keep repeating the same thing. That's the definition of insanity. I'm so angry at myself right now. I should know what I'm doing. And a lot of people assume that just because you're on YouTube that you know exactly what you're doing all the time, and you don't. So what is the most terrifying tool in the shop? Me. So I thought, I can't just leave it at that. I gotta try again and do better this time. Now, there's a few things that I did to prevent kickbacks on this one. I started on the right side and moved to the left, as you're supposed to. And I used push sticks or push blocks to hold that, just in case of a kickback. It's not gonna pull my hand into that bit. I should have been using push blocks the whole time. There's no excuse for not using them. It also helps me keep a better grip on the board, more pressure down. That way, if it does kind of give me a little resistance, I can fight that with the push blocks. And the third thing that I did was actually lower the speed of the router so that the bit isn't spinning as fast and isn't basically fighting me as hard. It actually cuts the wood instead of pushing it away from the bit. Now, what I learned was to be smart and not ignore the warning signs that happened 6 times. I still can't get over that. But I also learned that you can really batch these things out super fast using templates and a router bit if you do it properly and safely. Now, I didn't have any issues with this one as long as I followed the bit and done what I was supposed to do. This one gave me massive trouble because I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. So as embarrassing and shameful as it was to put this video out, I wanted to make sure that I shared that with you, that you know that I make mistakes, everybody else makes mistakes, and I'm not perfect. And I want to share this so that you don't make these mistakes and get injured. Today I want to show you how to properly attach a tabletop to a base. Let's do it. So you're making some type of table. It doesn't matter if it's an end table, a coffee table, a dining table, or a desk like this. So you need to attach that top so that it allows for proper expansion and contraction of the wood, the natural movement of the wood. This one is not attached yet. Let me show you how to properly attach this so that it doesn't split wide open like the Red Sea. Now there are a few ways to actually attach these tabletops. There's some that are called desktop fasteners. They look like this, they're figure 8s. You can use those. I love to use these Rockler tabletop fasteners. Get off me, freaking fly. Man, you better get out of my hair. Horseflies, am I right? These are my favorite way to attach a tabletop to an apron. These are tabletop fasteners. They come with screws and they come with the hardware. Some people call these Z-clips, but they're tabletop fasteners. They're in the shape of a Z or an S, depending on which way you turn them. They come 8 to a pack. They're very inexpensive. And I'll link in the description below to these tabletop fasteners. These are by far my favorite way to attach a tabletop to an apron because they're so easy to use. They're fast. They work, and they work good. And I've never had any trouble with them. Let me show you how we do it. So my router actually has an edge guide, which helps with this. If you don't have a router with an edge guide, you can just use a biscuit joiner. Easy, simple, or whatever you have to cut a slot. All right, the way I set this up is actually quite simple. So if you are going to use a router to cut your slots, you're just going to set this edge guide about a 1/2 inch away from the bit, and then the bit's going to be a 1/2 inch deep. Very similar to the fence you could set on the table saw. You're just going to use the router instead. If you don't have a router, I've actually done this on tabletops before I had the router. You just cut a dado a 1/2 inch in so that the tabletop fastener actually, it will fit between the blade and the fence. When you attach it, it'll have just a little bit of angle to it so you can actually pull it down a smidgen. And then you're going to raise the blade about a 1/2 inch up. That's going to give it a 1/2 inch in to go like that. So you're just going to cut a dado. Let me show you. So you would actually just cut that in the aprons before you assemble the table, and then you have a slot that runs the length of the tabletop slightly off of flat so that you could actually pull it down a little bit, and that actually works really, really well. I've done that several times on tabletops. Just cut it in the apron before you assemble the tabletop. That way you don't have to have a router or a biscuit joiner to actually use these tabletop fasteners. Just cut a 1/2 inch down, a 1/2 inch deep, and then these tabletop fasteners run in there. I've got my frame centered up on my tabletop, and now we want to install the tabletop fasteners. These things are very, very easy to use. All you're going to do, stick it in the slot you previously cut. Make sure you pre-drill the hole. You don't want this wood splitting at this point in the game. Don't drill too deep. If you're using an impact, make sure it's on the lowest setting. Just snug, that's all you need. You don't need anything else. Don't over tighten these things. I typically put 6 or 8 per top on something this size. This is about a 5-foot top, about 25 inches deep. There will be an entire build of this desk coming soon. That's how you put on a desktop. How you doing? I'm Matt. Today I'm going to show you 5 different ways to joint boards without a jointer. 5 methods include a piece of plywood, building your own jig, using a simple 4-foot level, just using tape, and then also using a circular saw. Let's get started. For a lot of woodworkers, this is a big challenge to be able to find a way to joint lumber without buying a jointer because jointers are expensive. So if you've watched this channel any time at all, you know that before I was blessed with that Wahuda jointer, that I was jointing with my table saw just using a level. This is probably the easiest way to get started jointing boards. It's not the best way, but it will get you by. So it will not make a perfectly tight seam every time, especially when you get into longer boards over about 4 feet. However, on shorter boards, it works very well. Let me show you how to do it. First and foremost, for this method to work, your blade has to be 90 degrees to your saw. So if it's not, then it's not gonna, your seam isn't gonna come out right. Gotta be 90 degrees. If it's not 90 degrees, you're wasting your time. And I'll drop a link in the description below, one of those little digital angle finders if you're interested. So I'm gonna be jointing the edge of this board using a 4-foot level. And all this is you just take a 4-foot, I like this I-beam aluminum style because it's not gonna bend and twist on you like a plastic. The reason this works, I get a lot of questions on why this works versus just using the fence. So the real reason this actually works is using a level on the table saw. I'm actually magic. I've actually sprinkled some magic dust on this, some magic sawdust on this level, and now it works because it's magic. The reason this method works is because you're giving this edge a flat surface reference on the other side. So whatever's going on over here on the right side of the blade, when it goes through the blade, then that's what's going to happen over here on the left. If I just use the fence, and I'm going to exaggerate, but if this board had a big bow in it like this, when I'm pushing it through, it'll actually do that on the blade. You wouldn't think it would, but it does in a small way. But that's just going to leave a non-flat, non-square cut on this side. When you use something like a 4-foot level, and it must go through at the same time or move with the board. If it does not move with the board, you might as well just use the fence. If you're just doing this and pushing it by, it's no different than the fence. All you've done is extend your fence. Let's try it. I'm gonna do 2 boards and then I'll line them up beside each other and show you. So now you can see it is not exactly perfect, but it's really, really close. I could probably run it through one more time and get it much better. All right, I'll run it through again, and you can see, man, this thing is really, really close. I mean, you can tell the difference in the grain patterns there, but I mean, that's just jointing with a level right there, so not bad. The second method on jointing with a table saw, you're just gonna build a simple jig for your saw using 3/4 inch plywood. Let me show you. So I'm gonna rip this down to 6 inches. What I did was just marked where the riving knife and the blade is, and then I'm going to clamp this here, move it over out of the way. I'm just going to take the riving knife off. So I'm just going to turn the blade on or turn the saw on and raise the blade up, and it's going to make that cut. Then I will turn the saw off, unclamp it, and move this back this way until it gets to the riving knife mark. I was actually originally going to raise the blade up, leave it spinning, and then pull the plywood back, but the thread of kickback there is way too much for me to actually want to do that. So what I did was just turn the blade on, raise it up, turn the saw off, lower the blade, move the jig, clamp it back down, then raise that blade back up like that. Once most of the material was cut out of there, then you saw me slide it kind of back and forth and get any irregularities out of there. That's a big word, irregularities. Right, it took me just a minute to figure that one out, but it looks really good, and I can actually, the more I do it, the tighter that seam is getting. You can see it's pretty tight as is when I push it together, and then I can actually, release it there. So one way to make this even better as a jointing jig is if you could take and put a piece of vinyl and stick it here, something that's slick. It won't actually hang the board as it goes through, but it makes this backside stick out just a little bit, about the same thickness as what you're actually taking off the lumber. That'll give this a flat surface to reference to after it's been cut on this side, and it'll just make jointing a little easier using this method. However, it does work even without that, but adding a piece of vinyl or something here on the backside will help you out. So that method actually works fairly well. Just for a quick jointing jig for your table saw, it's just a piece of plywood, run it up through there. It took me several passes to figure out how to do it properly. Extremely light pressure and take very, very little off of the material at a time. 64th, if that, just barely skimming it. Once you do that, you wind up with a good tight seam as equal to or about as equal to as the level jig. Now I've got another one I want to try and see if we can get it even better. Let's do it. If this video is bringing you value, click that share button, share it with your friends or family member who is also into woodworking, and hopefully it can bring them value as well. This is just an 8-inch strip of plywood, 3/4 inch. Now I'm going to make a jig. So I'm actually going to make a jointing jig, or you could actually use it as a tapering jig as well for tapering legs, that sort of thing. And what I'm going to use to do that is a router, this 1/4 inch relief bit, and a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch dovetail bit from Micro Jig, as well as some dovetail clamps that's going to go in this jig. It's going to make jointing on a table saw that much easier for you. If you don't have this stuff, there'll be a link in the description below to this stuff. It's not that expensive to get started with this, and they have several other options you can pick up if you want to get into that system. All right, so this is what I've done. I got my sheet of plywood cut out, and I've marked 4 inches from the end on each end. I'm going to draw a line because that's where my dovetail groove will go. And you just make this board however long your fence is, and then you're going to mark halfway of that distance, whatever that is for you. make a line, and then halfway between these two lines, we're gonna make another line so that we can have another groove here. And then we've got 2 marks, 2 inches from each end there. We'll make a mark down through there, and then that'll be our grooves that we're gonna cut. I don't have a router table, so that's gonna make things just a little bit more time consuming, but it's not, I don't think it's gonna be impossible to do. You set this 1/4 inch relief bit, and we have to cut the 1/4 inch grooves first. That way the dovetail bit doesn't actually have to take out as much material. It'll make it last longer, it'll make it a cleaner cut, etc., etc. So what I gotta do is set up a line, route that, change bits, route that, and over until I get them all done. So it's gonna take a little bit of time. So all I did was lined up, I put my router down there, lined up the center of the bit with the line, and then I just measured from there to the line and squared everything up. Gonna be a whole lot of blade changing. Man, I need a router table. I don't know why I was going the wrong way, but I was. Don't do that. So that's the dovetail track. And I bought these clamps that fit the dovetail track just like that. That's awesome. This is gonna be an awesome sled. Here we go. I gotta finish up these grooves and then I'll show you what this thing can do. Lesson number 1, don't pull the bit up. It'll make a hole. I think it'll be all right though, but don't pick the router up with the dovetail bit. Bad idea. So I've got all those grooves cut in there, those dovetails cut in there with that palm router. Router table would have been so much easier, but it wasn't too bad. I just had to switch the bits out and make sure they were the correct depth every time, and then set up that straight edge. It's pretty dang straight, if I do say so myself. I'm gonna put a 45-degree chamfer on 3 sides only. I'll show you why. So I'm just gonna measure over 1 inch from the edge, make a mark. Same thing here, make a mark. And then I'm just gonna line up my blade and take off a 1 inch corner at a 45-degree angle. I'm gonna do that on the 4 corners. I should have done this before I put the chamfer on, but live and learn. Boom, there it is. I like it, I like it a lot. I have high hopes for this working better than the other 2 methods. That was so simple to do. It just took a little bit of time swapping those bits out. If you've got a router table, you'll be done with that in no time. Put a little paste wax on there. I prefer tray wax because it doesn't stink. Johnson's paste wax actually has a real bad smell. That tray wax doesn't. Helps it glide butter smooth on that table. I like it. So the way this works, I've got my board that I want jointed. I've got my dovetail clamps. And we're just going to slide one in from the side. I've run this fence. I've run the fence to where this sled is actually just beside the blade. Now you can actually attach a miter groove or a miter, what do they call that? You can actually attach a miter slot piece of board down through there, a 3/4 inch piece of board, and make it run in the groove if you want. But for a jointing sled, you don't need it. Right? Because you're going to be holding it pressure against the fence. And so all you want to do is have that board overhang the sled itself. And so it's overhanging about an 1/8 inch maybe, just a little bit wider than the blade. It doesn't really matter as far as what the alignment is, so long as the blade cuts the entire board or cuts a strip off the board, because it's just up in the air and it's going to cut that edge off flush, and then you're going to flip it over, put it against the fence and run it through without the sled, and that's going to give you 2 parallel sides, which is what you're after. That makes me happy. That looks good. I like that. Boom. That's the best joint yet. Jointing sled. Man, I should have built one of those a long time ago. The level works okay, but the jointing sled wins this challenge by far. It's easy. It's quick. I think if I put a miter slot under there, a board that actually runs in the miter slot, or Microjig actually makes a 360 sled kit that'll actually attach to the bottom of this, and you can use it that way. Now this can actually be a tapering jig also, so it's a multi-function jig. Just as a bonus for you, if you want to use this as a tapering jig, all you need to do, if you had a board that you wanted to taper from say 4 1/4 to 3 3/4, all you do is line it up, your mark here, that's gonna be the cut line of your blade at 4 inches, and then back here you're gonna make that mark at 3 3/4 and clamp everything down. Really quick, the reason you keep this side square versus chamfering all 4 sides is you wanna leave one square side to reference for tapering. So if you're gonna have a board down here that's 1 inch and then up here it's 4 inches, you're gonna need something to reference that by, so this square edge will help you with that. If you're gonna be using this as a tapering jig, I would highly recommend either putting a 0-play miter bar underneath so that it runs in this track, or just cutting you a strip that fits in there like you would a table saw sled. Let's try it and see what happens. Look at that. So simple, so simple. So if you're tapering legs, whatever you need to taper, tapering jig slash jointing jig slash, now you've got a high fence. If you need that for whatever reason, you got a board that's taller and you're cutting a dado in it or cutting a rabbit in it or whatever, and you need a high fence, this just turned into a high fence. So this is a multi-purpose jig, and you got that as a bonus for watching this video. I'm very happy with this sled. Man, it just works so well. It's actually kind of an ingenious design that Micro Jig come up with. I bought all this stuff. What really tipped me off with this stuff was I had one of you viewers actually sent me the 360 sled kit. So just this piece here. When I got this, I started looking into it and saw that they had all of this other stuff, which was the dovetail bits, the relief bit, and then these clamps. And then I saw some videos. They've actually got a video on how to make this exact sled. I'll drop a link to that in the description below and you can go check that out. It has free plans, everything. And so you could actually make one of these for yourself using their guide. But this works really well. It works flawlessly to actually edge joint a board, and for tapering, things like that, it's gonna be, it'd be a game changer for you if you've got a table saw. So I actually didn't come up with this idea. I saw it on video by 3x3 Customs, Tamar over there. If you want to see how she does it, you can go check it out because she's working without a jointer as well. Double-sided tape, I don't have any, so I'm going to, for the video, improvise with a good old-fashioned duct tape. I would actually not recommend using duct tape for this because when you double it over like that, it's going to be really thick. That's why you should use double-sided tape. It'll all be really thin. But just for demonstration purposes, you're just going to take the tape on your sled or a piece of plywood is all this is going to be. You're going to take your board that you want jointed and just barely hang it over the edge of your plywood so that the blade's actually going to make the cut. And same thing down here, set it on top of that tape. That's just going to keep everything from slipping and moving, similar to what the clamps do on the sled. Once it's stuck, you should be able to just run it through, no problem. That easy. That is easy. Then all you'd have to do is just peel it up, take the double-sided tape off of your board. You've got a jointed edge. Now that I built the sled, it got me thinking. I know that's dangerous. Can I joint with the sled without a table saw, just using a circular saw? Let's find out. So I'm just going to clamp this 2x6 on here. Flip this over. This is going to work, y'all. Who believes? You got to believe in me. I believe. I believe. That's going to work. It's going to work. I believe I can fly. It's got to work, right? I've been trying to think about how to do this for years. Kabam. Check this out. Who thinks this is going to work? Boom. That works. I'm a genius. I know. You can tell me. I don't mind. That works. That works well. And it's going to be a good flat edge on this side. And now, obviously, you would need a table saw or something, or even a maybe the Craig Rip Cut could flip it over and use this side as a flat reference to, yeah, I think that would work actually. And then you would have two parallel edges and with a circular saw. Now, it would be hard to do with a 2x4 or anything smaller than a 2x6. You could probably still do it, but it would be much harder to do. It's flat. That's about as close as you're gonna get a rough cut board flat with a circular saw. And in case you don't know, a Craig Rip Cut is just a circular saw guide. Any circular saw fits in there, and you can actually put it to, say, a couple inches. It'll go down to like 1 inch. And the circular saw will actually ride in here like this. and then you could actually reference this edge to cut this edge, and you would have two parallel sides jointing with a circular saw. Those other methods you can use if you don't have a jointer. If you do have a jointer, I want to throw this in the challenge just to see how it stacks up against, especially that sled, because that sled was... For speed and convenience, obviously the jointer is going to win. Once you clamp these together, the gap goes non-existent. As you can see there, mash them together, and then of course I can slide them apart. That's really cool. I really like that this sled makes perfect flat edges. Perfect. They come together perfectly. As long as your blade is 90 degrees to your table, and as long as your board's not wampy-jawed, sled's the way to go. Now the taping method the taping method also works really well. You're just gonna have to stick and unstick every time, but that's an option for you if you don't want to do T-tracks or the micro jig match fit system. Match fit? Yeah. But now that I have this sled, I can use it for multiple uses, tapering, high fence, and then also jointing jig if need be. Multi-use sled. So it's really, I think, the winner because you can actually do more than just joint with it. So a few weeks ago I made this coffee table, and those X braces were at a higher angle than my miter saw was able to cut. My miter saw only goes up to 60 degrees one direction and 50 the other. The angle I needed to cut was about 62 degrees. So how do we accomplish that if the miter saw is actually limited to 60 degrees, or yours may be limited to 45 or 50 degrees? So for this project you need CA glue or double-sided tape and a flat board. You want to set your saw on 0 degrees, and you need a flat board, one that's not going to rock and move when you stick it down here. It's about as long as a miter saw fence. This is a common pine 2x6. You can use a 1x6. I recommend at least a 5.5 inch wide board. The thickness just depends. I used a 1x6 in the last one. The thicker piece that you're going to be cutting, the thicker this should be, up to about 1.5 inches. The reason you want a flat board to make sure it's no rocking and moving, you're going to need something stable to stick to your miter saw. If this thing is moving and rocking, it won't stick on one side or the other. You can use double stick tape. Put it on the wings, not where the saw pivots, because this piece is going to need to move. You're going to press it up against that fence, stick it down. That will probably work. I don't care for this method because double stick tape doesn't stick as good as CA glue. See how easy that come up? I actually made a YouTube short about this a few weeks ago, but a lot of people said because it was in that 60-second format, it was hard to understand and I didn't explain it well, so I want to explain it better in this one. I'm going to use Starbond medium thick in clear. A lot of people wanted to know if it would come up. You see, I've previously done this a few times on here and it's never stuck. You can use, I use a decent amount. Somebody said this was too much. Too much is not enough, right? I'll spray the board with the activator, then we'll set it in place. We've let that set for about 60 seconds, so now it's really good and dry. Now we're gonna take the saw and move it to 45 degrees this way. We're gonna make a cut. Now we're gonna move it to 45 degrees the other way. Now you're just gonna remove this piece that you just cut. Move the saw back to 0. 0 is now 45 degrees. This is the piece we just cut out, right? This was a 45, this is a 45, this is 90, correct? The back side is 90. Anything we lay in there now is going to be automatically at a 45. So if I wanted to cut this piece on a 45, I'll lay it against this piece and up against this piece, and I'm fixing to get a 45 degree cut. 45 degree cut. Let's say I need to cut this on 65 degrees. That's 5 degrees more than my saw can actually cut without this jig, which will now be 20 degrees on the saw, because if we start out at 45 and we add 20 degrees, that gives us 65 degrees. Lock it down at 20. You're gonna hold it tight against this fence and tight against the fence up here, or the board that's now our fence. That is a very steep angle that this saw couldn't have cut without this method. 25 plus 65 is a 90 degrees. I actually had several comments saying that the CA glue wouldn't come off of this saw, it was gonna ruin it. Not true, brown-eyed Sue. Just take your little rubber mallet. The glue's actually stuck to the board. Let me show you. Even if it sticks to the saw, we can get it off easily. This side's clean as a whistle. See how much better CA glue sticks than double-sided tape? It's actually on the board. There's a little right there where it ran out the back. If it doesn't pop right up with the board, you just take some sandpaper or even a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, and just scrape that paint up and then buff it back down with like a 400, 500 grit sandpaper. Good as new. It's not gonna hurt the saw. It's not gonna bond to that aluminum on your saw, and it comes right up. As a thank you for watching this entire video, I'm gonna give you 50% off anything in my store. All you have to do is go to 731woodworks.com/store. Use the code LONGVIDEO, all one word, and you can get a discount of 50% off any of our plans, planned bundles, board butter, merch, anything you see there. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know in the comments if you like this type video. We might look at doing a few more.